3 years from tonight, I will stand in a hall where the most powerful house in the kingdom will have to bow its head. 11 days. I had known for 11 days. And I had told no one.
You were never anything more than a substitute, Bryn. A placeholder. For the woman I actually wanted.
The floor did not move. The walls did not move. But something inside my chest just broke. And the substitute. What becomes of her?
Nothing becomes of her. She stays. She's convenient.
And that was not grief. Grief would come later, in the dark, in the hours when I could no longer pretend. I did not weep walking away. That would come later too. Tonight I only needed one thing. But to understand why, 3 years from tonight, that woman would make the most pouncil on the continent.
The door was not fully closed. That was the first mistake. Roderick's mistake. A man who has never once in his life worried about being overheard does not think to check a latch. Bryn Ashvane stood in the corridor outside it. One hand flat. Against the stone. Ancient, older than the kingdom itself, older than the name Ashvane, older than any promise a man had ever made a woman in the dark of a wedding night. Her other hand pressed low, beneath her ribs, where something the size of a bean kept its own small stubborn rhythm. 11 days. She had told no one. Not her ladies. Not the physician. Not even old Halden, who noticed everything, who had noticed the change in her color 3 mornings running and said nothing. That was Halden's way. To watch. To wait. To let a person come to him instead of prying it out of them. She had come tonight to tell Roderick first, before anyone. Before the kingdom knew it had an heir. She had dressed carefully, she had practiced the words in the mirror. Like a girl. I have something to tell you, foolish. She heard him before she reached the door, laughing low. Easy. The laugh of a man with nothing on his mind heavier than the wine in his cup. And then the words, you were never anything more than a substitute, Bryn. A placeholder. For the woman I actually wanted. The floor did not move, the walls did not move. But something inside her chest did. Something snapped. Not loudly. The way a thread snaps when you have been pulling it taut for 3 years without knowing it. She did not fall, she wanted to fall. Some part of her, some old girlish part she thought she had buried, wanted very badly to fall. To let her knees give. To let the stone floor catch her the way nothing else in this castle ever had. She did not fall. 'Cause falling makes noise. And noise gets you caught. Through the gap in the door she could see them. Roderick golden even in candlelight, golden the way certain metals are golden right up until you test them and find out they are only paint over iron. His crown sat on the table beside a decanter, careless. The way a man sets down a hat he does not much care for, and across from him Vera Stonewell, silk the color of something bled out of a wound. Hair like poured ink. A smile that did not reach anywhere near her eyes, because her eyes were doing arithmetic. Bryn had seen that look before on merchants. On men who wanted something, and had already decided how they would take it. And the substitute, Ver said, swirling her wine, unbothered. What becomes of her? Nothing becomes of her. Roderick did not even look up. She's convenient, a quiet woman who runs the household, asks for nothing. A pause. The pause of a man deciding to be generous. When you are queen. Something in Bryn went very still. Not grief. Grief would come. Grief always comes later in the dark, in the hours when a person cannot pretend anymore. This was not that, this was older. This was the thing that had kept a 9-year-old girl alive in a border town with no parents and no coin and no one coming to fetch her. The thing that counts exits before it counts anything else. The thing that goes cold and clear right when everything else in a person wants to scream. She stepped back from the door. Silent. 3 years in these halls had taught her which stones complained under a foot and which ones stayed quiet. She had learned it the way she learned everything. Necessity first, understanding after. She did not weep walking away. That would come later too. Here is what you need to understand about Bryn Ashvane. Because the corridor is only the beginning. And nothing that happens after it makes sense without this. She was not born to this. She was not raised in silk. She came to Roderick's court at 19 with 2 dresses. A dead father's sword she was not permitted to carry. and a memory sharp enough to hold every figure her father's steward had ever taught her. She married a king because it was arranged. She stayed because foolishly she would tell herself, later foolishly a marriage could be built the way a house is built. One stone at a time. Honest work laid down and left to set. For 3 years she did the work, not the work anyone saw, not the feasts, not the processions, not the moments where a crowd looked up at a balcony and saw a king and queen and believed, because they wanted to believe, that a kingdom runs on golden hair and a good jaw. The other work, the ledgers, God, the ledgers. Roderick could recite the names of 40 noble houses, and could not tell you, on pain of death, whether the treasury held enough silver to pay the garrison through winter. So Bryn learned it. Learned it from an old steward before the man died. Learned it the way you learn a language you will need to survive. Quickly. Completely without complaint, she balanced the books at night while Roderick slept off whatever feast had run long. She negotiated grain prices with guildmasters who assumed at first that a queen's presence at the table was ceremonial, and left the table having conceded terms to a woman half their age who had read every contract twice and caught every trick they thought too clever to notice. She settled a border dispute with the hill lords that would have cost the kingdom a war, and she did it in a single afternoon, in a language she had taught herself from a captured envoy's letters, because no translator in the castle spoke it well enough to be trusted. She did all of it quietly, because that was what a queen who wanted her husband's peace did. She did not need the credit. She told herself that so many times it nearly became true. She told herself it was love. Now she understood. It had been work, endless, unpaid, unacknowledged work. And the man she had done it for had just called her furniture, convenient furniture to be reassigned once the real queen arrived. She reached her own chambers, closed the door, stood in the middle of a room she had never once in 3 years been permitted to call home. They called it the Queen's Suite, tapestries worth a village apiece. A window of colored glass that turned morning light into something like jewels scattered across the floor. She had once thought it beautiful. Tonight she looked at it and thought, a lock keeps a thing in as well as it keeps a thing out. She laid one hand over her belly. All right, she whispered. Her voice did not shake. That surprised her more than anything that had happened in the corridor. All right, little one. He does not want us a breath. So we will not stay to be wanted. Here is the part that Roderick did not know. The part that would matter more, in the end, than anything said in that room, with the wine and the silk and the careless crowns on the table. 3 weeks earlier, going through the Treasury's spring accounts, a task Roderick had never once in 3 years asked to review, Bryn had found a discrepancy. Small at first, the kind of gap an honest clerk makes and corrects the following quarter. Except it did not correct. It grew. Grain levies that should have reached the eastern granaries showed receipts for half what the western fields had produced. Silver drawn against the crown's account for diplomatic gifts to houses that, when Bryn checked the guest ledgers, had sent no envoys and received no gifts. She had traced it the way she traced everything, patiently, silently, column by column, late at night by a single candle, because a queen investigating her own treasury in daylight invites questions, and Bryn had learned long ago that questions asked too early only warned the guilty. It took her 9 nights. On the 9th night she found the signature authorizing the largest transfer, not Roderick's Vera steward, acting the document claimed on behalf of the crown's interests in matters of alliances. Bryn had sat with that word for a long time, turned it over, understood slowly cold what it meant. Vera was not simply taking Bryn's husband. Vera or the house behind her, the Silver Moonlight, and Bryn now suspected, badly in need of coin, was bleeding the treasury dry to fund whatever came next. A wedding, a war dressed up as a wedding. Bryn did not yet know which. She only knew the numbers did not lie, and the numbers said the kingdom was hemorrhaging silver into Vera Stonewell's house, quietly, steadily, while the king who should have caught it was busy admiring the color of the woman's hair. She had copied every figure into a second ledger. Small, plain. The kind of unremarkable book a woman might use for household accounts and no one would look at twice. She had hidden it. She had told herself at the time that she was only being careful, that a queen who understands money understands the value of proof. She had not told herself the truth, which was that some cold, clear-eyed part of her had already known, long before tonight, long before the corridor, that this marriage was a house built on one stone laid crooked at the very bottom, and that eventually, inevitably, the whole thing would come down. She had simply been gathering what she would need to still be standing when it did. Tonight that instinct had a name. Tonight, that instinct had a face and a voice and a laugh she would hear for the rest of her life every time someone underestimated her. She did not pack first. That was the mistake people made, she thought. The mistake of every runaway in every story she had ever heard as a girl. They grabbed and fled, grabbed and got caught. Bryn sat instead at her writing desk, lit a single candle, pulled the Treasury's quarterly ledger toward her, the real one, the public one, and finished it. Every figure, every column, closed clean. Because an unbalanced book invites a hunt. A balanced one invites nothing at all. When the last column was closed, she turned to the final page. In the margin, where no one but a careful reader would ever look, she wrote a single line. The true state of the Crown's debts, recorded Osley, on this date, by the hand that kept them. Not a warning to Roderick. She was long past warning him of anything a record. So that when the collapse came, and she already knew, with the flat certainty of arithmetic, that it would come, no one could say she had caused it. She had learned that lesson early, in a childhood that taught her many things the hard way. The discarded are always blamed for the ruin they only predicted. She blew out the candle. She crossed to the tapestry of the running stag and drew it aside. Behind the tapestry, a seam of stone. She had built it herself over the better part of a year. A few stones loosened one week, worked free the next. Mortar chipped away in the dead hours when the castle slept. And no one thought to wonder where the quiet queen wandered at midnight. She had not known when she began it, what it was for. She had told herself it was nothing. Some leftover habit from a childhood of hoarding against hunger. A place to keep coin that was truly hers, earned from her own private trade in medicinal herbs. Herbs she grew in the physic garden and sold through a merchant 3 towns over who had never once asked her real name. Some deeper animal part of her, she understood now, had known exactly what it was for inside: a purse of northern silver untraceable, a set of traveling clothes in undyed wool, plain, the clothes of a healer cut to draw no eye. A forged letter of passage bearing a guild seal she had every right to use, having done that guild more favors than they would ever admit. A folded parchment, the deed to a cottage on the far side of a forest called the Bramwood, bought 2 years ago through a chain of intermediaries so long that not even Vera's spies could untangle it if they tried for a decade. And now tonight one more item to add, the second ledger. The one with Vera's steward's signature on it. She had never planned to run. She wanted that to be clear to herself, sitting there in the candlelight with the hollow open and her whole secret life laid bare in front of her. She had built this the way a sailor keeps a lifeboat lashed to the deck, hoping never to need it, knowing the sea. She thought, sitting there with the candle guttering low, of the man she had married, not the golden lyre in the room down the corridor, wine in hand, crown discarded carelessly on a table beside a woman who wanted nothing but the wearing of it. The other one. The boy of 22 she had first met across a betrothal table. Neither of them had chosen. Nervous in a way kings are stumped, not supposed to be nervous, asking her in a rushed, half-embarrassed whisper before the elders could interrupt, whether she preferred the eastern gardens or the western ones, because he wanted, he said, to make sure her rooms faced whichever way made her happiest. She had liked him that day. Truly liked him, before liking had any business becoming. Somewhere between that nervous boy and the man laughing through a half-open door, something had been allowed to rot. She did not know, sitting there in the dark with a candle burning low, exactly when the rot had set in, or whether it had always been there waiting, the way certain kinds of fruit look whole right up until the knife finds the center. She only knew that whatever kindness had once lived in him had been slowly, patiently starved by 3 years of a wife, who did all the difficult work of holding a kingdom together, and never once asked to be thanked for it until asking for nothing had, somewhere along the way, curdled into being worth nothing at all. She had loved Roderick. That was the shameful truth she would carry out of this castle, whatever else she carried. She had loved him honestly, and he had let her, and tonight he had laughed about it in another room, with wine in his hand, as though the last 3 years of her life were a story he was already bored of telling. She took off her rings, 3 of them. The betrothal ring, black iron to match his crown. The marriage band, engraved inside with a vow she now understood he had never once meant to keep. And the great sapphire he had given her before the Eastern lords, a public jewel, a thing meant to be seen, a thing meant to say, "Look how well I have provided for her," to men who never once asked whether she had been provided for at all. She lined them up on the pillow of the bed she had shared with him only when duty demanded it, neat, precise, like figures closed in a ledger. She left the coronet on its stand. She left every silk gown in the wardrobe. She left the earrings and the combs and every scrap of gold that had ever been pressed into her hand as payment for playing a part. She took her mother's ring, thin, worn, worth nothing to anyone but her. And she took the child. Near midnight came a knock, soft. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. Bryn's heart clenched before she remembered whose signal it was. She opened the door only as wide as it needed to open, and old Halden slipped through it sideways, the way a Funzer man might, though he had seen 60 winters if he had seen one, and every one of them showed in the lines around his eyes. He had served her father. Before that, her father's father. He had come into Roderick's household as part of Bryn's own retinue, the one piece of her old life the marriage contract had let her keep, and in 3 years he had never once asked her for anything. His eyes went to the rings on the pillow, then to the traveling clothes, then to her face. He did not gasp, he did not scold. He set down the small satchel he was carrying, folded his hands, and said in the low gravel voice she had known her whole life. He said it at last. Her composure, which had held through the corridor, through the ledger, through the rings, nearly broke at the sound of that voice. She swallowed it down. You knew? Not an accusation, she did not have the strength left for one. I've known what he is for a long while, girl. Halden's mouth twisted, something between a smile and a grimace. Hoped I was wrong. I'm old enough to have stopped being surprised when I'm not. He crossed the room, laid one weathered hand without asking permission, flat over the front of her dress, over the place where nothing yet showed. His eyes closed a long moment. Ah, he breathed, and something in his face rearranged itself. Wonder, grief. Both at once, the way a man's face moves when he understands two true things that do not want to sit together. That's why you're going now, he said. Not a year from now, Halden. You understand what you're carrying, a child, Bryn said. My child, the heir of the Ashvane line. His grip tightened just slightly on her arm, carried by the very queen he's about to throw away for a woman who wants nothing but his crown and his coin. Bryn's spine went straight. There's more, Halden. It isn't only me he's throwing away. She crossed to the desk, drew out the small plain ledger from beneath a stack of household accounts, and held it toward him. Vera's people have been draining the treasury. Grain levies. Silver marked for gifts that were never given. I found the signature 3 weeks ago. Halden did not open it. He did not need to. He looked at her face and understood exactly what kind of proof he was being shown. Then it's worse than I feared, he said quietly. It's proof, Bryn corrected. If it's ever worse, it's worse for him. Not for me. Something moved behind Halden's eyes, not quite pride, close to it. Listen to me, he said. If his mother's people learn of the child before you're gone, his mother is dead. His mother's allies, girl. His mother's line. A living Ashvane heir is the one thing that could unmake Vera Stonewell's claim before she's even crowned. She will not let that walk out the front gate, a beat. She would bury you in the Bramwood herself, and she'd smile doing it. The cold that had settled into Bryn in the corridor deepened. It did not feel like fear anymore. It felt almost like calm. Then she must not learn of it, she said. Neither he, least of all. Halden nodded, grim. A man like Roderick doesn't want what's his, not until someone else tries to take it. Right now he'd let you both walk. Give him a year. Give him a rival claim. And he'd cage you both without a second thought. They stood together in the candlelight. Two people who understood the world exactly as it was and not as any minstrel had ever sung it. Help me, Bryn said. Just to the edge of the Bramwood Road. After that I can vanish on my own. Halden was already reaching into the satchel. You won't go by the road, he said. It's watched. Every road out of this castle is watched tonight, whether you knew it or not. Bryn's breath caught. Watched by whom? Vera's people. They didn't come here alone. And they've had a month to learn the pattern of days. He drew a small dark vial from the satchel and pressed it into her palm. There's another way. Beneath the physic garden, behind the old well. A drain that hasn't carried water since the river 40 years back. It's filthy, it's dark. It will bring you out below the eastern wall, past every watcher they've posted, and onto open ground before dawn, and the vial for the child. His voice dropped. Not to harm it, never that, to quiet it. A strong young life sends out its own kind of signal, the same way you felt the marriage bond snap tonight, before you even understood what you'd heard. If anyone with the old blood comes close enough, the babe's own strength could betray you both. Will muffle that signal. One night. Use it when you reach the drain. It will not hold a second time, so we will only get the one chance to slip past them clean. Bryn closed her fingers around the vial. Cool glass. Impossibly small for what it held. Why are you helping me? You've served this house your whole life. Halden's mouth curved. It was not quite a smile. I served your father, he said. And your father's father before him. I have never in 60 years served a golden fool who takes a woman's silence for her insignificance. He took her face in both hands the way he had when she was a girl of 9 with a dead father and nowhere to go. You are the best thing that ever walked into these halls, Bryn Ashvane. This kingdom does not deserve you. I will not stand by and watch that woman put you in the ground. He stepped back. Businesslike again, an instant the way old soldiers can turn feeling on and off like a lamp now. Change your clothes, we have little time. The wool was rough. After 3 years of silk it felt, strangely, like coming home to a version of herself she had nearly forgotten existed. She braided her hair the plain way. Smudged ash across her cheeks to dull the fineness of her skin. When she looked in the mirror she did not see a queen. She saw a woman who might be anyone going anywhere. That anonymity, she thought, was worth more to her now than any crown ever forged. They went down through the sleeping castle, Halden leading, Bryn following, the purse of silver against her ribs, the child quiet beneath her heart, her mother's ring on a cord around her neck, the small plain ledger, the one that would one day unmake a woman named Vera Stonewell, sewn into the lining of her cloak, past the kitchens where the banked fire still glowed low and orange, past the chapel where she had knelt so many nights praying for a marriage that had never, not for one single day, been real. Out into the physic garden, where the cold herbs breathed their green breath into the dark. Rosemary and rue, and the tall silver stalks of moonwort she had planted with her own 2 hands, back when she still believed that planting things and staying to watch them grow was the shape her whole life would take. At the well behind the garden, Halden knelt and worked his fingers into a seam of stone. A low iron grate came away with a groan that made them both freeze. Listen, no sound answered from the castle. Below the grate a black throat of tunnel breathed up cold air and older smells of bat. Drink the vial now, Halden said. She drank bitter earth and root. A strange gentle hush moved through her almost at once. She felt it unmistakably as the small bright presence beneath her heart went quiet, went still, as though some had laid a hand over a candle flame without quite putting it out. Go quickly, Halden said. Go quiet, follow the tunnel down, always down. When you smell the marsh you're near the mouth it. Come with me, Bryn said. She had not planned to say it, it came out anyway, the way true things do when there is no more time left to dress them up. No, child. Halden's eyes shone in the low light, the first time in her life she had ever seen anything close to tears on that weathered face. If we both vanish, they'll know it was planned. They'll know helped you, and they'll hunt harder for both of you, Halden. I stay, he said. I'll be the old fool who slept through the Queen's flight and knew nothing of it. They won't suspect me. Men like Roderick's advisors never think an old man capable of anything but sleeping. He pressed one last thing into her hand, a small folded scrap of paper, a name. A man in the river town of Greymore. He owes me a debt older than you are, and he asks no questions. He'll see you safe as far as the Bramwood Road. Bryn gripped the old man's hand, held it, did not let go for one long moment. Thank you, she said. 2 words. Not nearly enough for 60 years of quiet loyalty, but they were all she had left before the tunnel took her. Go, Halden said, rough now. And whatever you hear behind you, do not turn around. There is nothing back there worth the risk of your feet slowing down. Halden did not move from the well until the sound of her had faded entirely from the tunnel below. He stood there a long moment in the cold, one hand still resting on the stone lip of the grate, and he thought, the way old men think when there is no one left to hear it, of a night 30 years gone. Because he had stood over another dark hole in the ground once before, a cellar, not a tunnel, a burning house, not a castle. A girl of 9 with soot on her face and her father's cooling body 2 rooms behind her, and Halden, then a soldier still. Then a man who had not yet learned the particular ache of watching someone you love walk toward danger, because it is safer than the danger behind them. He had pulled that girl out of the dark that night. Tonight he had put her into it himself. The difference, he told himself, was that this time she was choosing it. This time she was not being carried. She was on her own 2 feet into whatever came next, and there was a kind of grim satisfaction in that, even wrapped inside all the fear. He turned from the well, straightened his coat, and by the time the first gray edge of dawn touched the eastern towers, old Halden was exactly what he had promised to be, an old man asleep at his, having heard nothing, seen nothing, and suspected less. It would be, he thought, the finest performance of his long life. The last thing she saw of the castle was his face above the grate, silver lit by moonlight, mouthing some blessing in a tongue older than either of them. Then the grate settled back into place with a soft iron sigh. The dark closed over her, and Bryn Ashvane, queen of a kingdom that had never once been hers to keep, was gone. The tunnels was everything Halden had promised, and worse. It stank of a century's worth of stillness. In places the ceiling dropped so low she had to crawl, palms sinking into cold muck, breath loud and ragged in her own ears, every sound amplified by stone until she could hear her own heartbeat and could not tell if it was hers or the child's. Once something living slid across the back of her wrist. She bit down on a cry, kept moving. Because to stop was to think, And to think of Roderick, of the laugh through the half-open door, of the whole golden weight of the life she was crawling away from, would be to stop entirely. And to stop down here in the dark, with watchers posted above every road out of the castle, was very close to dicing, so she counted instead. Handholds. Breaths. The distance between one whetstone and the next. She thought of nothing but the next foot of tunnel in front of her, because that was the only kingdom left that was truly hers to govern. She did not stop moving when the tunnel finally opened at last, into the grey hush of pre-dawn air, above the reeking flats of the eastern marsh. She pulled herself out onto the mud and lay there one long moment on her back, looking up at the stars fading into the coming light, and she let herself feel it. All of it, the grief, the terror, and underneath both of them strange, fierce, unwelcome, something that could only be called joy. 10 breaths. She allowed herself exactly 10. Then she rose. Filthy, free. She turned of shape of the castle rising against the graying sky, and she walked out into the marsh toward a river town called Greymoor. Behind, in a warm, high room, Roderick Ashvane slept the untroubled sleep of a man who believed he had arranged the world exactly to his liking. He did not yet know that the most valuable thing he had ever owned had just walked out of his life through a drain in the earth, carrying his heir beneath her heart, carrying, sewn into the lining of a rough wool cloak, the very proof that would one day bring his whole golden kingdom down around him. He was still asleep when the sun came up. He woke, that first morning, to an empty room and thought nothing of it at all. Queens kept their own hours. She had likely risen early for the physic garden, as she so often did, some quiet errand among her herbs that never much interested him. It was not until the second morning, when her ladies came to him nervous and pale, that the shape of what had happened began slowly to arrive. The rings on the pillow, untouched since the maids had found them. The wardrobe, full every silk gown exactly where it had hung for 3 years, as though their owner had simply stepped out and would return any moment to claim them. She had not returned. He had ordered the castle searched, top to bottom, cellar to and found nothing, because there was nothing to find. He had sent riders down every road within a day's hard ride, and they had returned one by one with nothing to report, because she had not taken any of the roads his riders knew to search. Vera had comforted him, that week, with a tenderness that felt at the time like exactly what a wounded man deserved. It would be years before he understood how carefully that comfort had been timed, how precisely it had arrived just as the search parties were giving up, how convenient it had been, in hindsight, that the one woman capable of reading his treasury's books had vanished within days of a wedding alliance requiring urgently that no one look too closely at where the crown's silver had actually gone. He would remember, for a long time afterward, standing in that empty room, staring at 3 rings lined up with a precision that had seemed at the time merely strange, and thinking only, with the particular selfishness of a man who has not yet learned to see past his own wounded pride, that she had left without so much as a note explaining why. It would take him the better part of 2 years to understand that she had in fact left him a note. He simply had never once thought to check the margin of a ledger for it, because he had never once in 3 years of marriage thought to open the ledgers at all. He would not learn what he had lost for a long time yet. But when he did, when the numbers finally stopped adding up, when the guild stopped extending credit, when the granaries ran thin and the roads went quiet, and a man he trusted implicitly finally found the nerve to tell him what everyone else already suspected, he would remember this night. He would remember laughing, and somewhere very far from that castle, in a small stone room above a garden that did not yet exist, a woman with ash on her cheeks and a plain iron ring around her neck would already be building the life that would one day unmake him. She did not know it yet, not fully. Not the shape it would take. Not the courtroom. Not the ledger spread across a great table beneath a painted ceiling. Not the moment a man she had once loved would look up and see for the first time exactly who had been standing beside him all along. She only knew this. The sun was rising over the marsh and she was still walking, and the child beneath her heart was still impossibly hers. That was enough. For now that was more than enough. Greymoor smelled like fish and wood smoke and the particular exhaustion of people who work with their hands for a living. Bryn stood at the edge of it in the gray hour before full light, mud to her knees, ash gone streaky on her cheeks, and thought, this is what safety smells like now. Not roses. Not beeswax candles in a queen's chamber. Fish and smoke. She almost laughed. Did not. Laughing felt like a door she was not ready to open, because behind it was crying, and behind that was, and she did not have time for any of it. Not yet, so she walked. The man Halden had sent her to find was called Garrick Voss, and he did not look like a man who owed anybody anything. He looked like a man the river had chewed on for 40 years and spit back out, thick through the shoulders, gray already threading a dark beard. Standing behind a trade counter stacked with crates of something that smelled sharply medicinal. He took one look at her, at the mud, at the way she held her ribs like she was protecting something underneath them. He did not ask her name. That was the first thing she noticed about him. He did not ask. "Halden sent you," he said, "not a question." "Bad night, you could say that." He studied her another second, long enough that she felt the old instinct rise in her, the instinct that counted exits, that measured a man's hands in this distance to the door. And then he did something that surprised her. He turned around, went back to stacking crates, as if she were nothing more than a delivery he had been expecting. "There's a room in the back," he said over his shoulder. "Water's cold, bread's stale, don't care for questions and don't much like answering them either. That work for you?" Bryn's throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "That works," she said. She did not tell everything. Not that first week, not the second. She told him her name was Rue. Just Rue. He accepted it the way he seemed to accept most things, without comment, without the flicker of disbelief she expected, because Greymore was a town built entirely out of people who had arrived from somewhere they did not wish to name, and one more was hardly worth remarking on. She paid for the back room in coin at first. Then, when the coin started to feel too finite, too much like a thing that could run out at exactly the wrong moment, she paid in work. Because here was the thing about Bryn Ashvane that 3 years of silk gowns had never quite managed to bury. She knew things. She knew how to read a ledger the way other people read a face. She knew which herbs stopped a fever and which only masked one until it came back twice as vicious. She knew 9 dialects because she had taught herself out of necessity, in a marriage that had given her nothing except time alone at night, and an urgent gnawing need to never again be caught not understanding a room. Garrick Voss ran a trade in medicinal goods up and down the river towns. His books were a mess. His inventory was worse. He was, by his own admission, a man who could smell a fair price the way a hound smells rain coming, but who could not for the life of him keep 2 columns of numbers from lying to each other. "You're bleeding silver," Bryn told him, the third week, sitting at his back table with his ledgers spread in front of her like a woman laying out cards. "I know that, you're bleeding it in 3 places at once and you don't know which one's the worst." He looked up. Something in his face changed. Not suspicion exactly. Curiosity wearing suspicion's coat. "And you'd know I would. Where's a healer from nowhere learn to read a merchant's books like that?" Bryn did not look up from the ledger. "Same place I learned everything," she said. "I needed sit there." Did not push. She was starting to understand that this was simply the shape of him, a man who had learned, somewhere along a hard road, that the fastest way to lose someone's trust was to demand it before it was offered. "Fix it," he said finally. "Whatever it's bleeding. Fix it and I'll pay you what it's worth. And if it's worth more than you can afford?" Garrick Voss smiled for the first time since she had met him. Small, crooked. "Real. Then we'll be even more honest with each other than we already are," he said. Which given the last 3 weeks is saying something. She fixed it. It took her 11 days, working at night after the physic garden, her physic garden now, a scrap of dirt behind the back room that she had cleared with her own hands, planting rosemary and rue and the last of the moonwort seeds she had carried out of a castle in a twist of cloth, had been watered and weeded and put to bed for the evening. 11 days to find the leak, one more to prove it. It was not theft, not exactly, it was worse in its own small way. A factor 2 towns over who had been quietly padding transport costs, skimming the difference, betting correctly that a man as busy and as trusting as Garrick Voss would never sit down long enough to catch it. She caught it. She laid the proof in front of him on a Tuesday morning, the ledger open to the page, her own careful notations in the margin. Garrick read it twice. Then he looked up at her with an expression she would come to know very well over the following months. The look of a practical man recalculating, in real time, exactly how much a person in front of him was worth. "You just saved me a season's profit," he said. "I did. Halden owed me a debt," Garrick said slowly. "I think I might be starting to owe you one instead." Bryn allowed herself, for the first time in 3 weeks, something close to a smile. "Good," she said. "I intend to collect." She stayed in Greymore 6 weeks. Long enough to earn coin, long enough to earn Garrick's trust, long enough for the ash and the mud to wear off her, and leave behind a woman who simply looked tired. The way every woman who had walked a hard road looked tired. She had never planned to stay longer than that. Greymore was too close to the roads Vera's people watched, too close to the river that carried gossip as easily as it carried grain barges. When she left, Garrick did not ask where. He only pressed a folded sheet of paper into her hand, names of contacts along the western trade road, and told her gruffly to write if his name ever proved useful to her. It took her the better part of 2 more months to find a place that felt right. 2 months of moving quietly from town to town along the western road, careful, unhurried, a woman who had learned that speed draws eyes and patience does not. She stopped in 3 villages before she found the 4th, a small market town the maps called Fenmore and the locals called with the particular fondness people reserve for unlovely things they have grown attached to, the last stop before nowhere. By then she was near 4 months along, her body finally beginning to betray the secret she had carried so carefully out of a castle in the dark. There was an abandoned herb house at the edge of the market square, roof half caved, garden gone to weeds so thick they had swallowed the fence. She looked at it and felt something she had expected to feel: recognition. Not of the building, of herself, because this was exactly what she was now, something abandoned, gone half to weeds, standing at the edge of everyone else's town waiting to see if there was still a use in her. She bought it for almost nothing. The owner, an old widow moving in with her daughter 3 villages over, was simply glad to be rid of the taxes on it. Bryn Rue moved in the same week. She had not told anyone the whole of it. Not even Garrick, who had visited once already, on his trade circuit, and left extra bread in her satchel without being asked, and asked no questions about why a healer newly arrived kept one hand pressed low against her stomach when she thought no one was looking. She had not told the town. The town, as it turned out, did not much care. Fenmore was full of women who arrived carrying secrets and asked no explanations of each other, because half of them had a story of their own they would rather not be asked to tell either. She worked. That was the thing that surprised her most in the months that followed. How much the work itself became a kind of medicine. Clearing the garden with her own swelling body on her knees in the dying warmth of late summer, planting the seeds she had carried out of a castle physic garden a lifetime ago. Moonwort, rue, the tall silver-leafed things that grew nowhere else in the border country because no one else had ever bothered to carry the seeds this far. By the time the first frost came, her shelves held tinctures and salves that no other healer in 3 valleys could match. By the time the snows began, farmers were bringing her their fevered children on sledges from towns whose names she had not yet learned to pronounce correctly, and merchants were paying her in silver and in favors. And something that had once been a ruin with a caved-in roof had become, in less than half a year, the busiest doorway in Fenmore. She built it the way she built everything, one honest stone at a time. Child art at the turn of the year, deep winter. A night so cold the wind screamed sideways through every gap in the shutters, and the midwife she had sent for, a broad, unbothered woman named Ottilie, who had delivered half the babies in the valley and buried, by her own count, entirely too many of their mothers, arrived at the door half frozen and immediately took what charge of a room Bryn had until that moment been managing entirely on her own. How long? Ottilie demanded, already rolling up her sleeves. Since dusk, and you didn't send for me until now? I was medging. Ottilie looked at her. Looked at the sweat-soaked hair plastered to her forehead, the white-knuckled grip on the bed frame, the calm, terrible focus in her eyes. Of course you were, the midwife muttered, not unkindly. Some women scream the whole house down. You're the other kind. The kind that just goes quiet and gets it done. Is that bad? It's exhausting to watch, Ottilie said. Now push. The boy came into the world close to midnight, not squalling, silent, eyes already open, dark and gray, old in a way newborn eyes are not supposed to be old. Ottilie laid him on Bryn's chest, and for one instant, one single suspended instant that Bryn would remember for the rest of her life, the whole small house seemed to hold its breath. The candles guttered. All 3 of them, at once, though there was no draft, no reason for it. Nothing but a stillness in the air like the pressure before a storm that never quite breaks. Ottilie went pale. Muttered something under her breath. An old word one Bryn did not recognize but understood persistently, the way you understand a warning even in a language you have never learned. What? Bryn said. Sharp, frightened despite herself. What is it? Ottilie shook her head slowly. Recovering. Nothing wrong with him, she said. Strong. That's all. Strongest little pulse I've felt in 30 years of catching babies. A pause, a long look at the child, and then at Bryn. You come from somewhere with old blood in it, girl? Bryn's arms tightened around her son. I come from nowhere, she said, same as everyone in this valley. Ottilie studied her another moment. Then let it go. The way people in border towns had learned to let things go. Because a question pressed too hard sometimes came back around and bit the one who had asked it. If you say so, the midwife said. Whatever he is, he's healthy. And he's your. That's the part that matters. She named him Ren. It meant nothing to anyone, that was the point. Ottilie stayed 3 more days than she needed to. which was not, she insisted gruffly, out of any particular fondness for the mother or the child, but because the roads were bad and her old knees did not care for ice. Bryn did not argue the point. She simply noticed, on the second morning, that the midwife had quietly restocked the woodpile without being asked, and on the third that she had scrubbed the hearthstones until they shone, and she understood that some people show their affection the way rivers carve stone, slowly, without ever once admitting that is what they are doing. "You'll want to watch him close," Ottilie said on the morning she finally left, wrapped in every scrap of wool Bryn owned against a wind that had not once let up. "Strong ones like that, they draw a certain kind of notice. Not from folk like us. From folk with old blood who know how to feel it." Bryn had gone very still at that. "What kind of folk?" "The kind that don't usually trouble themselves with border towns," Ottilie said. And there was something knowing in the look she gave Bryn then, something that suggested the old midwife had put together a great deal more than she was saying out loud. "You keep him close the first year. Keep him quiet where you can. And if a stranger ever asks after Moonwort in a voice that doesn't sound like it belongs to a farmer, you shut your door and you don't open it again till they're 3 fields gone." "You think I have something to hide?" Ottilie had smiled. The particular smile of a woman who had delivered 3 generations of secrets into the world and buried most of the mothers who had carried them. "I think everyone in this valley has something to hide," she said. "I think you've got better reasons than most. Now go on. Feed that boy before he wakes the whole street hollering about it." She had been right, of course, about the watching. It simply took the better part of a year to arrive. Here is what the months after the birth looked like, compressed the way memory compresses things. Not in days but in textures, in small moments that stood out sharper than the ones around them. Wren asleep against her chest while she ground herbs with one hand. Wren's fist closing, impossibly small, around one of her fingers while a farmer's wife wept with relief because her daughter's fever had finally broken. The particular ache in her lower back from a winter spent bent over a mortar and pestle with an infant strapped to her front, and the particular pride that came from realizing, some months in, that the ache did not matter, because for the first time in years she was tired from her own work done on her own terms for her own reasons. Garrick visiting every few weeks with his trade goods and his questions he never quite asked. Watching him hold Wren once, awkwardly, at arm's length, the way a man holds something he is afraid of breaking, and something in his broad, weathered face going soft in a way she had not expected, and did not quite know what to do with. "You're good at this," she told him, the first time she caught him laughing, actually laughing, at Wren's fist closing around his thumb. "Good at what? Standing here like an idiot? Being trusted by something that can't lie to you yet." Garrick had gone quiet at that, looked at her for a long moment. "Everyone should get that," he said finally, "once in their life. Someone who trusts them because they haven't learned any better yet." She had not known then how much weight was sitting behind that sentence. She would learn it later. There were other visits too, smaller ones, that Bryn would not fully understand the shape of until much later, looking back. Garrick arriving on a night colder than the season warranted, claiming his usual trade route had simply brought him this way, though Fenmore lay well off any sensible circuit for a man moving goods toward the southern guild markets. Garrick appearing, more than once, within a day or two of some difficulty she had not written to tell him about. A bad debt from a customer who would not pay. A wagon wheel broken on the market road, as though some quiet network of eyes along the border had simply taken to keeping him informed without either of them ever discussing it directly. She asked him once, half teasing, how he always seemed to know when something in Fenmore had gone sideways. Coincidence, he said, not quite meeting her eyes, and busied himself checking a strap on his cart that did not, as far as she could tell, need checking at all. She had let the lie stand, because some lies are simply an early, clumsy way of saying something a person is not yet ready to say outright. And she had learned, over a long hard road, exactly how much patience a good lie like that one deserved. There was a night, that first spring after Wren was born, that Bryn would carry with her for the rest of her life, though nothing about it seemed remarkable while it was happening. A farmer named Oswin brought his daughter to her door near midnight, the girl burning with a fever that had already resisted 3 days of the village healer's remedies, her breathing gone thin and rattling in a way that made even Oswin's weathered face go the color of ash. Bryn had taken one look at the child and known, the way she had learned to know things in a castle full of liars, that the girl's own healer had misread the sickness entirely, treating a fever when the true trouble was settling deep in the lungs. She had worked through the night. Wren asleep in his basket by the hearth, waking twice to be fed, settled again each time with one hand while the other ground bitter root and steeped it into something that smelled. Oswin said later, like the inside of a thundercloud. By dawn the girl's breathing had eased. By the following evening, her fever had broken entirely. Oswald tried to pay her in silver he plainly could not spare. Bryn had refused it and taken instead a promise that felt to her considerably more valuable. That he would tell no one where he had brought his daughter, only that a healer in Fenmore had saved her life, and let the details of it stay exactly as unremarkable as they needed to remain. It was a small thing, it should have been a small thing. But Bryn understood, holding her own son close as the sun came up over a garden she had built entirely with her own hands, that this was the first time in her whole life she had done something enormous, something that mattered purely because it was right, with no crown watching and no husband to credit, and no ledger anywhere that would ever record what she had done that night. She had cried a little once Oswin and his daughter were safely gone down the road. Not from grief. From something else entirely, something she had not felt in 3 years as of marriage and had very nearly forgotten the shape of. By the following autumn, when 9 months old and finally walking in the stubborn, furious way of a child who has decided the floor has wronged him personally, Brynroo was, by every measure that mattered in a town like Fenmore, a success. Her tinctures were sought after 3 valleys over. Her signature, the same clear precise hand that had once balanced a kingdom's treasury, now appeared on trade letters to the medicinal guild in the south, offering fair dealing and reliable supply, asking nothing in return but the same. The guild, to its quiet interest, found that its newest and most reliable southern contact wrote with a hand and a precision that felt oddly, uncannily familiar. No one connected it to anything. Why would they? A vanished queen and a border healer occupied 2 entirely different corners of the world, and no clerk copying trade correspondence had any reason to lay the 2 side by side. She should have known it would not last. She did know, actually. Some part of her had known from the very first night in the tunnel that safety, real safety, was never going to be a permanent address. It was going to be a season. A good one, hopefully, but a season. Here is a thing Bryn did not know yet, and would not learn until a lonely inn on the Bramwood Road months from now. While she was clearing weeds with a swelling belly and building a life stone by stone in a forgotten market town, another woman in a castle Bryn had left behind was quietly beginning a war of her own. Kestra Ashvane had never much liked Vera Stonewell. It was not jealousy, whatever the court whispered. It was instinct, the old animal kind, the kind that makes the hair rise on the back of a neck for reasons the mind has not yet caught up to. She had watched Vera move through the halls of Ashfell in the weeks after Bryn's disappearance with the particular ease of a woman arriving somewhere she believed she had always belonged, and something about that ease had never sat right. So Kestra had started asking questions. Quietly at first. The kind of questions a grieving sister-in-law asks when she is simply trying to understand how her brother's wife could vanish without a trace. Where had the household guards been posted that night? Who had signed the last treasury transfers before the disappearance? Whether anyone had thought to check the tapestry behind the running stag, which had, curiously, been hanging slightly crooked ever since. It was the crooked tapestry that led her to the letter. Not a letter exactly. A cipher worked into the household accounts Bryn had left behind, disguised as ordinary notations any clerk would pass over without a second glance. It had taken Kestra the better part of a year to understand what she was looking at, because she had not been raised, as Bryn had, to read a ledger the way other people read a face. She had been raised to smile at banquets and say nothing of substance, and it had taken her a long, humbling season of teaching herself otherwise before the numbers finally began to speak. What they told her once she learned to listen turned her blood to ice. Grain levies, diplomatic gifts to houses that did not exist, a steward's signature that did not match the steward's hand on any other document in the castle. Bryn had not merely fled a bad marriage. She had fled with proof of something far larger, and left behind for anyone patient enough to find it, the first thread of the tapestry that would eventually unravel it all. Kestra pulled on that thread for the better part of 2 years. She did it the way Bryn had done everything, quietly at night, telling no one, because questions about her brother's new betrothed draws exactly the wrong kind of attention. She befriended a steward's clerk who owed her a discreet favor. She petitioned, under a false name and a plain traveling cloak, the sealed archive at High Reach, because some deep instinct told her that whatever she was circling would eventually need a room built entirely on the principle that a signature does not lie. And somewhere in the second year of her quiet unraveling, going through papers no one had touched in 2 decades, she found the thing that stopped her breath entirely. Her own mother's physician's notes. Altered twice, by two different hands, in the weeks before the old queen's sudden, unremarked death. A payment buried 3 ledgers deep, from House Stonewell's coffers to a name Kestra did not recognize, dated the same season her mother had first taken ill. She had sat with that discovery for 3 days before she could make herself believe it. And then she had done what frightened, furious grieving people do, when they finally understand the size of what has been done to them. She had packed a satchel, told no one where she was going, and gone looking for the one person in the world who might actually touch her understand what she had found. She did not know, riding south along roads she had never traveled before, whether Bryn Ashvane was even still alive. She only knew she had to find out. The season in Fenmore ended in early autumn, roughly 9 months after Wren had been born. A full year and a half now since a corridor and a half-open door had rearranged the entire shape of Bryn's life, though neither woman yet knew how closely their 2 long, separate roads had already begun to bend toward the same point on the map. It started, as these things always seem to, on an unremarkable afternoon that began exactly like every other afternoon that summer had offered her. It started with a stranger in the market square, not obviously a stranger. That was the trouble with the ones who came looking, Bryn would think later. They never announced themselves. They dressed like traders. They asked about herbs like customers. They only made one mistake, and it was small, and it was the kind of mistake only a woman who had spent 3 years reading rooms full of liars would have caught at all. He asked for moonwort. By name. Not the scissor-leafed stuff or whatever's good for fever, the way every actual customer in Fenmore described it, because moonwort was not a common word this far south. It was a word from the old tongue, a word used almost exclusively in the northern courts, in physic gardens attached to castles, in exactly one place Bryn had ever heard it spoken with that particular inflection. She was behind her counter, Wren's the sling against her chest, and she felt every muscle in her body go still and cold at once. Moonwort, she repeated, keeping her voice light. The voice of a healer, not a queen. Not many ask for that by name this far south. The man, tall, unremarkable, a trader's coat that fit a little too well for a man claiming to have walked 3 days on the road, smiled. "I've traveled," he said. "Where from? North," he said. "Word is there's a healer in these parts who grows the real thing, not the substitute stuff half these market stalls pass off as moonwort." Substitute. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Bryn kept her hands steady. Kept her voice steady. Her heart had begun to hammer in a rhythm she recognized from exactly one night, in exactly one corridor a lifetime ago. "I might have some," she said. "How much were you looking to buy?" "However much you'll sell," the man said. His eyes moved briefly, unmistakable, to the sling against her chest. And the boy," he added too casually. "Healthy little thing. Strong pulse on him, I'd wager. Can feel it from here almost." Bryn's blood went to ice because a trader does not talk about a stranger's infant having a strong pulse. A trader does not feel a thing like that from 3 feet away. Only one kind of person could. "He's a good sleeper," she said, and the lie came out smooth, practiced, 3 years of court diplomacy finally paying its dividend. "That's about the extent of his talents so far. Now moonwort. I've got some drying in the back, give me a moment." She turned, walked unhurried into the back room. The moment the door closed behind her, she was moving. She found Garrick 2 hours later at his warehouse on the edge of town, and the words came out of her in a rush she could not slow down even if she had wanted to. "He knew the word," she said. "Moonwort, not the market word. The court word. Nobody uses that this far south unless they've been trained to." "Slow down," he asked about Wren. "Not like a strange ask, a bay. Like." He was measuring him. Testing Garrick set down the crate he was carrying. All the easy warmth gone out of his face in an instant, replaced by something harder. Something that looked, for just a second, like it had been a soldier once, and before it had been a merchant. It had been, in fact, though Bryn would not learn the particulars for some while yet. Garrick Voss had spent 6 years in a border garrison, before he ever touched a trade ledger, young and hungry and certain, the way young soldiers are always certain, that discipline and duty would be enough to keep the people under his protection safe. They had not been enough. A raid he still would not speak of in any detail, a village he had been posted to defend and had not defended well enough, had taught him at 19 exactly how little certainty is worth against a determined enough enemy. He had left the garrison within the year, traded a sword for a trade route, and told himself, for a long time afterward, that a man who could no longer be trusted to guard people with steel, could at least be trusted to keep his word with numbers. He had not expected, in a warehouse that smelled of dried herbs and river damp, to feel that old soldier's instinct rise back up in him quite so sharply. But it did, fully unmistakably the moment Bryn said the word hunted. Rue, he said. Quiet. Careful, I think you told me what you're actually running from. Bryn stood very still. More than a year of trust built one honest transaction at a time, and now, standing in a warehouse that smelled of dried herbs and river damp, she understood that the season was over whether she was ready or not. You should sit down, she said. Not all of it, not yet. But enough, the castle. The name she had worn there, and the name of the man she had worn it beside, the words that had ended everything. The ledger, the real one, still sewn into the lining of a cloak she had not worn since Greymore, and what it proved about a woman named Vera Stonewell. Garrick listened without interrupting. His face did not change much. That was, Bryn would come to understand simply, the shape of the man. Steady in a crisis the way some men are only steady when nothing is actually wrong. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. An heir, he said finally, testing the word. You're telling me that boy's heir to an actual crown. I'm telling you he's my son Rue. His name is Ren, she said sharper than she meant to. That's all he needs to be, right now. Not an heir, not a claim, not a piece on anybody's board. My son Garrick held up both hands. Not surrender, unzersting. All right, he said. All right, but you understand what this means. If they've found you. They haven't found me, not yet. They've found a healer who grows moonwort. In a town 3 days off any road a northern trader has a reason to travel. She shook her head. That's not nothing. But it isn't caught either. Not yet, and if it becomes caught? Bryn looked down at Ren, asleep against her chest, entirely unaware that the whole shape of his small, safe world had just cracked down the middle. Then we make sure it doesn't, she said. Old Halden arrived 4 days later. She had not sent for him. That was the first thing that told her something was badly wrong. Because Halden did not travel without cause, had not left the castle in over a year and a half by her last knowledge of him, and the sight of him coming up the road into Fenmore, leaning harder on his walking stick than she remembered, his face gray with 3 days of hard riding, sent her heart into her throat before he had even dismounted. Halden. Girl. He nearly fell off the horse. She caught his arm, steadied him, felt how thin he had gotten. You need to hear this from me before you hear it from anyone else. What's happened? The northern trader you turned away last week. Halden's breath was ragged. He wasn't the only one they sent. There's 3 more, working the border towns from Greymore to the Bramwood, and they're not looking for Moonwort Bryn. They're looking for a healer with a strong-blooded child. Vera's people have widened the search. Bryn's stomach dropped. How close? Close enough that I rode 3 days without stopping to warn you. Halden's eyes found Ren sleeping in his basket by the hearth, and something in the old man's face cracked open with a tenseness that made her chest ache. Close enough that I nearly didn't make it here before they did. They're here? Not yet. But stays. Maybe less. He gripped her arm. You need to move him. Tonight if you can manage it. Move him where? Her voice rose despite herself, the calm cracking for the first time in a year and a half. Halden, I built a life here. A garden, a name. People trust Rue. They don't ask questions of Rue. And if I run again? If you don't run again, Halden said, quiet and terrible, they will take that boy from your arms and they will call it a mercy. Because a living Ashvane heir walking free is the one thing that can unravel Vera Stonewell's entire claim before she's even crowned. You know what she'll do to make sure that never happens. Bryn closed her eyes. She knew. They did not run that night. That was Garrick's argument. Delivered flatly, practically, the way he argued everything. No theatrics. Just the plain math of it laid out on the table between them. Running blind gets you caught, he says. Running smart gets you gone clean. You've got a network now, Rue. Guild contacts, trade routes. People who owe you favors up and down 3 valleys. Use it. There's no time to use it. There's exactly enough time. If we move tonight instead of panicking tonight. Looked at Halden. How many men did you count watching the roads? 2 that I saw, likely more I didn't. 2 men can't watch every road out of a town this size. Not if we give them 3 roads to watch at once, and only use the one they're not looking at. Garrick was already pulling a map from beneath his counter, spreading it flat. There's a river crossing 4 miles east that most traders don't use because the toll's too steep. Nobody watches a crossing nobody uses. Halden leaned over the map, old soldier's instincts sharpening despite the exhaustion in his face. That could work. It'll work, Garrick said, if we move before dawn. Bryn looked between the 2 of them. The old man who had served her father, and the merchant who had asked no questions for a year and a half, and was now, without hesitation, laying his own trade routes and his own safety on the table for a woman he had known less than 2 years. Why? She said quietly to Garrick. Why are you doing this? This isn't your fight. Garrick did not. You saved my ledgers, he said. Saved a season's profit with nothing but a candle and a sharp eye. I don't forget things like that. A pause. Something rawer underneath the practical tone. And that boy trusts me. Grabbed my thumb the first time I ever held him and hasn't let go of it since. Not really. I don't much like the idea of men coming to take that kind of trust away from a child too young to understand what he's lost. Bryn's throat tightened. Garrick. Don't, he said gruff. We don't have time for it. Pack what you need. We move at first light. They did not make it to first light. That was the twist neither of them saw coming, not because the plan was wrong, but because the men watching the roads were better than Halden's count had suggested, and one of them, patient in the way trained hunters are patient, had simply been watching the herb house itself instead of the roads leading out of town. It was Halden who heard them first. Old instincts honed over 60 years catching the wrong kind of a quiet outside the shuttered window an hour before dawn. He hissed. Now, both of you, down. Bryn dropped to the floor with Ren clutched against her chest, one hand instinctively cupping the back of his small head. Garrick doused the last candle. The room went black and silent except for 3 people trying very hard not to breathe. The door did not simply open. It was tested, slowly, a hand on the latch checking the way a checks a lock he expects to be able to defeat if he needs to. Halden moved before either of them could stop him. He was old. He would tell her later, wry even through the pain, that his knees had informed him of exactly how old the moment he hit the floor. But 60 years of soldiering do not simply evaporate because a man's joints have started to complain, and when the door finally gave, and a shape stepped through it, Halden was already moving. Already between the intruder and the corner where Bryn crouched with her son. It happened fast. Faster than Bryn could process at the time, only able to reconstruct it afterward in fragments. The scrape of steel, a grunt of pain that was not hers, Garrick's shout. The crash of a body hitting the overturned table, and then abruptly silent. When she dared to look up, the intruder was gone, fled out the broken door into the dark, whether from injury or simple recalculation of the odds, she never learned. Halden was on the floor. Halden, I'm fine, he was not. Blood was already soaking through his sleeve, dark and fast, and his breathing had gone shallow in a way that made every instinct in Bryn's body scream at once. Fine, get the boy. Get moving. That's the only thing that matters right now. I'm not leaving you bleeding on the floor. You are, Halden said, and there was a command in his voice she had not heard since she was 9 years old, and he had pulled her, screaming, away from a burning building that had been her home. You are, because if they come back and find both of you here, everything I did tonight was for nothing. Garrick. I've got him, Garrick said, already moving, already binding the wound with a strip torn from his own shirt, his hands steady despite the blood, despite the dark. It's deep but it's clean, he'll live if we move fast. Then move, Halden gritted out. All of you now. They did not use the river crossing, there was not time, not with Halden bleeding and needing a healer's attention within the hour. And so the plan Garrick had so carefully laid out an hour before, was abandoned entirely in favor of the oldest and least clever option available to them. Running in the dark toward the one place Bryn knew for certain she could stitch a wound and hide 3 fugitives at once. Her own back room. The one place cruelly that they had just fled. They won't expect us to come back to it, Garrick said, half carrying Halden, Bryn just ahead of them with Ren bound tight against her chest, silent and impossibly mercifully asleep through all of it. Not tonight. Not after tonight, he was right. It was the kind of move that only worked because it was so obviously wrong, that no hunter would think to guard against it. They made it back inside as the sky began finally to lighten toward gray. Bryn stitched the wound herself. Hands steady in a way her heart was not. Years of physic garden knowledge and border town practice narrowing down to this single desperate hour. Needle, thread, the old man's blood dark under her fingernails. Halden's jaw clenched against sound he refused to escape. You did this to yourself, she muttered, half a sob buried in the words, getting between me and a man with a blade. Would do it again, Halden said, teeth gritted. Don't waste breath arguing with an old man who's already made up his mind. You could have died, didn't, he said. Won't either, not from this. A pause, his eyes finding hers through the pain. Finish the stitches, girl. We've got a long road ahead of us and I intend to be well enough to ride it. Halden survived the night. Survived the week that followed, though it left him gray and slower than she had ever seen him. A limp that would never fully leave his left leg for the rest of his days. But the town was no longer safe, that much was beyond argument. Word moved fast in border country. And within days the whole of Fenmore was murmuring about the break-in at the healer's houses. About a stranger fled into the night. About the quiet widow woman named Rue, who had apparently had more secrets tucked behind her herb shelves than anyone had guessed. Bryn did not wait for the whispers to become questions, and the questions to become the wrong kind of attention. She packed what mattered, the ledger sewn into her cloak, the last of her silver wren's small collection of blankets, the deed to a cottage in the Bramwood she had never once needed until now, and she left the herb house standing empty, the garden already going back to weeds, exactly the way she had found it a year and a half before. Where now? Garrick asked, as they loaded the cart in the gray dawnlight. Bryn looked west, toward the mountains, toward a kingdom she had not seen and nearly see again, at least not soon. There's a free city, she said slowly, called High Reach, a council that judges debts between kingdoms and guilds. Halden mentioned it once before he was hurt. You've got no debt to collect there. I've got the best documented claim against a failing northern crown that any council in this world is going to see, Bryn said, and a ledger with a signature on it that's going to matter a great deal more than a moonwort trade dispute, once the right people finally get hungry enough to look. Garrick studied her for a long moment. The same look he had given her the first week she had shown up in his warehouse, mud-streaked and unwilling to explain herself, recalculating in real time exactly what kind of woman he was dealing with. You're not running anymore, he said slowly. Are you? Bryn lifted Wren into the sling against her chest. Looked back once at the empty herb house that had been, for a year and a half of good hard work, the closest thing to a home she had built with her own 2 hands since she was a girl of 19 with a dead father's sword she was not allowed to carry. I ran once, she said. It saved my life and it saved his. A nod toward Wren. But running only buys you time, Garrick. Eventually you have to decide what you're going to do with it. And what are you going to do with it? She turned back to the road. West toward the mountains. Toward a failing kingdom that did not yet know exactly how badly it needed the woman it had thrown away. I'm going to collect what I'm owed, she said, not with an army. Not with a scream in a throne room. Her hand found the ledger, sewn safe against her ribs, the proof that had waited nearly 2 years for exactly this moment. With the truth. In a room where the truth can't be laughed off or overheard through a half-open door or buried under a golden man's excuses. Halden, still leaning hard on his stick, allowed himself something close to a smile. That's the girl I remember, he said quietly. Not the queen they dressed up and displayed. The woman used to balance her father's accounts by candlelight because she couldn't stand to see a column that didn't add up. That girl's dead, Halden. Bryn said, not This is who came after her. Good, Halden said. I like her better. They did not travel directly to High Reach, not yet. There was a season of preparation first, a season Bryn would come to think of later, as the true turning point, the weeks where the pieces that would eventually unmake an entire kingdom were quietly, methodically assembled by people who had learned, the hard way, that patience was the only weapon a person without an army actually possessed. Halden's leg needed time to heal enough to ride the distance. Garrick's business needed arranging so an extensive stepsons would not collapse what he had built. And Bryn needed the one thing she had never quite had in a year and a half of running and building and running again. She needed word from inside the castle. It came eventually through channels so indirect that tracing them back would have taken Vera's spies a decade even if they had known to look. A traitor who knew a guildsman who knew a clerk in the treasury office. Bryn thought grimly that she herself had once quietly kept honest for 3 straight years. Before there was no one left to keep it honest at all. The reports, when they finally reached her, were not good. The grain trade had faltered through the 2 seasons she had spent rebuilding a life first in Greymoor, then in Fenmore. Real hunger, the kind that had never once touched the lower villages while a quiet queen kept the ledger's balance and the merchant's suite, had begun to show in the border settlements closest to the castle. The crown's debts, unmanaged for the better part of 2 years, had come due all at once. And the guild's that extended etched on the strength of one trusted signature had grown suddenly, coldly unwilling to extend anything at all. There were desertions in the garrison. Men who had not been paid in seasons, tired of promises and golden speeches, simply walking away from posts their fathers had held for generations. And there was talk, quieter, ugly, spreading the way rot spreads from the inside out, of a woman at the king's side. Vera Stonewell, wearing a sapphire that had once belonged to another queen, unable to command so much as the loyalty of a single kitchen maid. Bryn read the reports by candlelight, ran asleep in his basket beside her and felt something she had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction. Not quite. Something colder. something that had been waiting patient as frost for exactly this moment to finally show itself. He never learned the numbers, she said quietly. To no one, to the empty room, to the ghost of a marriage that had ended in a corridor nearly 2 years ago. He never learned a single name that mattered. He married a woman who did all of it for him, and he called her a substitute. And now the whole intricate machine of his kingdom is grinding itself to pieces because he never once thought to ask how it ran. Garrick, sitting across the table mending a harness by lamplight, glanced up. You sound almost sorry for him. I'm not, Bryn said. I'm just finally understanding something I should have understood 3 years ago. What's that? She folded the report, set it aside, looked for a long moment at her sleeping son. That I was never the substitute, she said. I was the load-bearing wall. And a house doesn't stand very long once you knock the wall out from under it. There was in those preparation weeks a quieter evening that Bryn would remember almost as clearly as anything that happened in the great hall itself. Halden's leg had healed enough by then to bear his weight without the stick, though he still favored it walking, a habit she suspected would outlast the wound itself by decades. They had taken a room above a tavern in a market town 2 days shy of the Bramwood Road, waiting on word from a contact of Garrick's who could confirm exactly when the council would next sit, and for once there was nothing urgent to do. No stranger to flee, no wound to stitch, only an evening and Wren asleep at last after an hour of the particular Furia energy only a child near his second year seems able to summon at bedtime. Halden sat across from her, working oil into the leather of an old belt, with the slow, careful attention of a man who has learned, over 6, that idle hands invite idle grief. You're frightened, he said without looking up. I'm not, you are. I watched you not sleep 3 nights running. He set the belt aside. I've known you since you were small enough to fit under one arm, girl. I know the shape of your fear same as I know the shape of your handwriting. Bryn was quiet a long moment, watching the. What if it isn't enough, she said finally. The ledger, the years of work. What if I walk into that hall and it simply isn't enough to matter? Halden considered the question the way he considered most things, slowly, and without the comfortable lies people usually offer each other in moments like this one. Then it won't be enough, he said. And you'll have lost nothing you didn't already choose to risk the day you decided you'd rather be right than comfortable. That's the whole of what courage ever is, Bryn, not certainty. Just the willingness to walk in anyway, not knowing. That's not very comforting. Wasn't meant to be. A faint, weathered smile. I served your father 20 years before served you. He used to say the same thing near enough, before every fight he ever walked into that he wasn't certain of winning. Said the only soldiers who never lose sleep are the ones who've stopped caring what they're fighting for. He picked the belt back up. You've never once stopped caring. That's not a weakness, whatever it feels like at 3 in the morning. That's the whole reason you're going to walk into that hall and make it matter, whether the council masters expect it of you or not. Bryn had not answered that. She had only reached over, in the quiet that followed, and rested her head briefly against the old man's shoulder, the way she had not done since she was small enough, as he said, to fit under one arm, and let the fire burn a while longer before either of them said anything else at all. There was one more piece that had to fall into place before high reach, one more turn that neither Bryn nor Halden nor Garrick had seen coming, and the one that finally, irrevocably, decided the shape of everything that would happen in the great vaulted hall of the Council of Debs. It came in the form of a second visitor. Not a hunter this time. Not one of Vera's people, dressed as a traitor asking Moonwort by its court name. Alone. Traveling under a plain cloak with no house colors, no guard, nothing to mark her as anything other than what she claimed to be. A traveler passing through, in need of a room for the night. She arrived at the small inn on the Bramwood Road where Bryn, Halden, and Garrick had taken shelter for the fortnight, waiting for Halden's leg to strengthen enough for the final leg of the journey. And she recognized Bryn, not Rue, not the healer, not the careful fiction Bryn had worn for a year and a half, the instant their eyes met across the common room, not with surprise. With relief so total it nearly buckled her knees. You're alive, the woman breathed. Oh, thank every old god still listening. You're actually alive. Bryn's hand went instinctively to the knife she now kept at her belt, every instinct screaming danger, until the woman lowered her hood and Bryn saw, beneath travel dust and hard weeks on the road, a face she recognized from a different life entirely, a face from the castle, not a servant, not a courtier, Kestra. Roderick's own, the one member of his family who had never once, in 3 years, treated Bryn as furniture. The one who had sent quietly, careful letters of warning after Bryn's disappearance was first discovered. Letters that had never reached her, because Bryn had been 3 towns and 2 false names away by the time they were written. Kestra. Bryn's voice came out barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? How did you even find? I've been asking after you for weeks, Kestra said, and her voice cracked on the words exhaustion and fear and something like grief all tangled together. Ever since I finally understood the letter you left. The one hidden in the seam of the tapestry, the one nobody else thought to check. Bryn's blood went cold. I left no letter. You left a warning, Kestra said, encoded. I found it not long after you vanished, and it took me the better part of a year, just to understand what you were actually trying to tell me, because you wrote it for a reader who already half knew the answer, and I did not. She glanced around the common room, lowered her voice further. About the debts. About Vera's people moving silver where it shouldn't move. You knew, didn't you? You knew what she was doing to the treasury long before you ever heard my brother's voice through that door. Bryn said nothing. She did not need to. The truth was written plainly enough on her face. I have to tell you something, Kestra said, and for the first time her composure cracked entirely, the exhaustion of a long hard journey finally breaking through. Something worse than the treasury. Something I only confirmed a month ago, and it is the reasons I have been on the road myself ever since, trying to find you before anyone else did. Kestra, you're frightening me. Good, Kestra said grimly. You should be frightened. Because it isn't only Vera behind all of this. It's her mother. Her hands were shaking now, gripping Bryn's arm with a desperation that spoke of months of carrying a secret entirely alone. The Silver Moonline has been planning this for longer than either of us have been alive. Bryn, my brother isn't the architect of any of it. He's the tool. He was always only ever the tool. The room seemed to tilt very slightly around Bryn's feet. What are you saying? Kestra took a breath, steadied herself. And when she spoke again, her voice had gone flat and cold in a way that reminded Bryn, uncomfortably, of her own voice in the corridor nearly 2 years ago. I'm saying our mother didn't die of a fever, Kestra said. I'm saying I have proof. Proof I stole out of that castle at no small risk to myself. That slowly, over the better part of a year, 20 years passed, by people working for the very house my brother was, decades later, persuaded to fall in love with. Silence. Ren stirred in his basket, made a small sleepy sound, settled again. Brynn stared at the woman in front of her, a woman who had once been nothing more than a sister-in-law at the edge of court gatherings, polite and distant, and who had just, in the space of 5 sentences, turned everything Brynn thought she understood about her own marriage inside out. This changes everything, Brynn said quietly. I know, Kestra said. That's part of why it's taken me this long to find you. I petitioned this council's own archive to reopen the old inquiry, months ago, before I ever set out to look for you myself. I needed the paper trail secured first, in case something happened to me on the road. She glanced, briefly, meaningfully toward the shape of the ledger. Brynn still wore sewn against her ribs. But whatever you're planning to do with what you know, you're going to need what I know too. And I think between the two of us we might finally have enough to bring the whole rotten thing down properly. Where it can't ever be rebuilt. Garrick, who had gone very still throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke, low and grim. High Reach just got a great deal more complicated, he said. Halden, leaning on his stick by the fire, allowed himself a slow, weary exhale, the sound of an old soldier watching a battle plan grow suddenly dangerously larger than anyone had prepared for. Or, he said quietly, it just got exactly big enough to actually work. Brynn looked down at her son, then at the woman who had just handed her a truth heavier than anything she had carried out of that castle in the dark. Then, finally, west toward the mountains, toward a kingdom teetering on the edge of its own collapse, toward a council hall she had not yet seen but already, somewhere deep in the cold, clear part of herself that had never stopped counting exits, understood she was going to walk into and change forever. Then we'd better make sure it works, she said. Because we're not just going to High Reach to collect a debt anymore. She looked at Kestra, at Halden, at Garrick, still holding the harness he had forgotten he was mending, watching her with an expression that had, somewhere along this whole impossible road, without either of them quite naming it, become something more than simple loyalty. We're going to tell the truth in the one room in this world, where the truth can't be laughed away, she said. All of it. And we're going to let the whole council watch a kingdom's foundation finally be forced to answer for what's been built on top of it. Outside, the wind picked up along the Bramwood Road, carrying the first cold breath of a new autumn toward the mountains. Toward High Reach, toward a reckoning nearly 2 years, one's ledger, one stolen truth, and one very patient woman in the making. The road to High Reach took 9 days. 9 days of Ren strapped against her chest, of Halden's leg aching worse with every mile, of Kestra riding just behind her with a satchel of stolen proof that could burn a kingdom to the ground. 9 days to think about what she was walking into. Which was not nearly enough time. Because how do you prepare for the room that decides whether your husband's an entire comes or dies? You don't. You just keep riding. High Reach rose out of the valley on the 7th day, towers of pale stone, iron bridges strung across a river gorge like something a giant had stitched together and forgotten to hide. No king ruled here, no crown mattered here, only a council of guilds and city masters grown wealthy on one simple, brutal principle. Commerce respects no bloodline. Bryn stood at the city gates and felt, for the first time in almost 2 years, something that was not quite fear and not quite hope, something closer to arrival. Last chance to turn back, Garrick said quietly, beside her. No, it isn't. No, he agreed, it really isn't. Took rooms at a guild house near the river. Practical. Exactly the kind of lodging that told anyone watching, and someone was always watching, in a city built entirely on the business of other people's debts, that this was not a delegation trying to impress anyone. Kestra spread the stolen documents across the table that first night. Candlelight caught the edges of pages that had traveled half a continent sewn into linings, and hidden beneath false bottoms of trunks. This is everything, she said. Everything I could carry out without them noticing it gone. Bryn read by lamplight until her eyes burned. Payment ledgers, physician's notes quietly altered. A steward's confession, extracted, Kestra admitted flatly without apology, under considerably more pressure than a confession should require. All of it pointed one direction, Vera's mother. The architect, the hand behind the hand. Your mother didn't just die of a fever, Bryn said quietly, setting down the last page. No, Kestra said. She died because she started asking the same questions you started asking. About money. About signatures that didn't match the transactions they authorized. Her jaw tightened. She just didn't have 2 years to build proof before someone noticed her looking. The room went very quiet. I have, Bryn said finally. The council would sit in 3 days. In the meantime, High Reach filled with the representatives of every creditor holding a claim against the failing North, and with the delegation of the North itself, come to plead. Or beg. Or buy time it did not have. Bryn saw them arrive from the guildhouse window on the second sing. She knew the banner before she could make out a single face. Black iron on gray. The running wolf of House Ashvane. Her breath caught despite 2 years of preparation, despite every hour spent steeling herself for exactly this moment. Because preparation and actually seeing it, actually watching that banner move through streets that did not bow to it anymore, were 2 entirely different things. The delegation was smaller than a king's delegation should be. That told her something immediately. A powerful crown sends a glittering embassy to overwhelm its creditors with spectacle. A dying one sends only what it can still afford. She counted riders. Marked the poor condition of the horses. Noted the absence of the great lords who should have ridden at the front. This is who would have 2 years ago fought for the honor of standing beside their king. And then she saw him, Roderick. He rode at the head of his diminished company, and even at this distance she could see what the years had done. Still golden. Still tall. But there was a grayness beneath the gold now, a hollowness. The look of a man who had stopped sleeping and started listening every night to the sound his own kingdom made as it came apart around him. He wore the crown. It looked on the streets of a city that owed him nothing, like exactly what it was. A piece of metal on the head of a debtor. Beside him on a horse dressed better than any of the guards rode Vera Stonewell. Wearing a sapphire that flashed even from this distance. The great public jewel Roderick had once given his queen before the Eastern lords. Left, on a pillow, in the dark. Vera sat her horse beautifully. Looked at the free city around her with the particular disdain of a woman who had never once had to earn the goodwill of anyone who did not fear her, and she was riding right now through streets full of people who did not fear her at all. That's her, Garrick said quietly, coming to stand beside Bryn at the window. He had guessed. Of course he had guessed. He had probably guessed weeks ago and simply waited in his patient way for her to be ready to say it out loud. That's her, Bryn agreed. They say the king does nothing without her word. He watched Bryn's face, not the street. They say a queen vanished in the night, and the kingdom's been dying ever since. Do they say why she ran? No, Garrick said, the stories never do they? There's always a woman who vanished. Nobody ever bothers asking what she was running from. Bryn turned from the window. Sit down, she said. I'm going to tell you the rest of it. Because in 3 days I'm walking into that hall, and before I do, you deserve to know exactly whose crown you've been helping me burn down. She told him everything that night. Not the fragments she had offered in pieces over the past 2 years. All of it, laid out plain, the corridor, the words, the ledger. the drain in the dark, a son born silent with eyes too old for a newborn's face. Garrick listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet a long moment, turning something over behind his eyes. That boy, he said finally. He's the heir to that crown out there. Yes. And that man, the failing king in the tin hat, he doesn't know his son is alive. No, Bryn said. And he won't learn it from me. Not until I decide he's earned the right to. Studied her. You didn't come here for a throne. I came here to collect a debt. She met his eyes, steady. Those are two different things, and I intend to keep them separate. If you can't help me do that. I can, Garrick said before she had even finished the sentence. Then he did something that surprised her more than anything he had done in 2 years of quiet, careful loyalty. He reached out, took her hand, the one wearing her mother's thin, and bowed his head over it. Not the way a subject bows to a queen, the way one honest person honors another. I'll help you collect your debt, he said, and I'll keep every piece of it to my grave. Whatever you decide once this is over, wherever you go after. He straightened, cleared his throat, suddenly gruff again, suddenly himself. I'd count it the honor of my life to keep standing at your back. Bryn felt something in her chest ease that she had not fully realized was still clenched. Something that had been clenched, if she was honest with herself, since a corridor nearly 2 years ago. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than the words could carry. On the morning the council was to sit, Bryn woke before dawn, the way she always had on the mornings that mattered most. She dressed in silence, careful not to wake Ren, who slept curled against Kestra's side in the narrow guild house bed, his small chest rising and falling in the particular deep, unguarded sleep of a child who trusts absolutely that the adults around him have already handled whatever needs handling. She envied him that standing in the gray pre-dawn light, lacing her boots. She could not remember the last time she had slept with that kind of trust in anyone at all, herself included. Halden was already awake when she came down, sitting at the small common room table with 2 cups of something bitter and hot, one of which he pushed toward her without a word. Garrick joined them a few minutes later, dressed plainer than she had ever seen him. No traitors of finery. Nothing that might draw an eye away from the woman he intended everyone in that hall to be looking at instead. Nervous, he asked, watching her hand wrap around the cup. Terrified, Bryn admitted, because there was no longer any point pretending otherwise. Not with these two. Not this morning. I've spent 2 years building toward a single hour, and in a few more of them it will simply be over. One way or another. It'll go the way it's meant to go, Halden said. Final. The way he said most things he had already decided were true and did not intend to argue further. You didn't build this on hope, girl. You built it on proof. Proof doesn't get nervous, it just waits to be read. She thought of that, walking the short distance from the guild house to the great hall an hour later. The leather case of documents held against her chest is the way she had once held an infant against it, crossing a marsh in the dark. The city was already stirring around her, merchants opening shutters, the particular busy hum of a place built entirely on the small, unglamorous work of keeping accounts honest. It struck her, walking those last few streets, how strange it was that the thing which had once made her feel invisible, the quiet, unglamorous labor of balancing what other people would not be bothered to balance themselves, was about to become the very thing that made an entire hall of powerful strangers finally unmistakably see her. The Council of Debs convened that very mid-morning, beneath a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations old merchant ships had once navigated by, in a hall so vast that the murmur of 100 creditors rose into it and simply vanished, swallowed whole. Bryn sat among the agents of the southern medicine trade. Ren in the care of a guild nurse in the gallery above, safe out of sight, exactly where she needed him to be. Her leather case of documents on the table in front of her, dark wool. Her mother's ring. A stillness she had spent 2 long hard years learning how to wear. Halden sat at her right hand, legs still stiff, jaw set. Garrick at her left. Kestra, cloaked and hooded, in the gallery with Ren, close enough to move the moment she was needed, hidden until exactly the right instant. Around her sat the representatives of every guild and city, holding a claim against House Ashvane. And the sum laid out on the great master ledger at the front of the hall was staggering. A mountain of debt, accumulated in the years since a certain quiet queen had stopped balancing the books. At the far end of the hall, on a low bench that placed them beneath the level of the council itself, sat the delegation of the North. Roderick, Iron Crown Vera beside him in her stolen sapphire. A handful of gray, exhausted advisors who had clearly stopped deceiving some time ago that anything good was going to come out of this room. They had come to plead. And the architecture of the hall had already told them exactly how their pleading would be received. In high reach, the debtor sits below the creditor, king or no king. Bryn watched Roderick's face as the master ledger was read aloud, debt by crushing debt, and saw him understand slowly that there would be no mercy here. This was not a court of honor where a handsome man might charm his way to leniency. This was a counting house with the majesty of a temple. Its only god was the balanced book. The grain guildmaster who spoke first was an old woman with hands like weathered rope, and she did not raise her voice once because she did not need to. She simply read the shortfall harvest by harvest, 3 years of promised deliveries that had arrived, if they arrived at all, at half the weight the contract specified. When she finished, she looked not at Odessa Vane, but directly down the hall at Roderick and said only, "My granaries fed your soldiers for a decade, my lord. I would have gone on feeding them gladly, on nothing more than your word. It was not I who broke that arrangement." The Iron Guildmaster who followed was younger, sharper, and considerably less patient. He laid out figures showing ore shipments diverted mysteriously toward destinations that matched disturbingly closely the private holdings of House Stonewell, and asked flatly whether the council intended to treat that diversion as ordinary mismanagement or as something considerably more deliberate. Odessa Vane noted the question, did not yet answer it. The hall, sensing the shape of something larger circling beneath the surface of the morning's proceedings, grew quieter with every claim that was read. Roderick answered none of it, could answer none of it. He sat, crown heavy on a head that had clearly not slept properly in longer than a season, and Bryn watched something in his posture change with every debt recited. The slow visible collapse of a man discovering, in the most public room in the free cities, exactly how little he actually understood about the thing he had spent his whole life believing belonged to him. The council master was a severe old woman named Odessa Vane, who had governed the Council of Debts for 30 years, and had never in living memory been moved by a plea. She called the creditors forward one by one. The iron guilds, the shipping combines, each laid out what the crown owed, each demanded satisfaction. And Roderick sat below them all with no answer, because a man who never learned the numbers cannot argue the numbers. Vera sat beside him with nothing to offer at all, because beauty is not a currency in a counting house. Then Odessa Vane called the agent of the southern medicine trade. Bryn rose. She felt the eyes of the hall turn to her, this composed, dark-clad woman rising among the great commercial powers of the free cities. She felt more sharply, the eyes of the northern bench turned to her. Roderick looked at her. Without recognition, he saw a guild agent, a creditor, a stranger. 2 hard years and a healer's plainness had done their work, and the Golden King did not know the woman he had once called convenient, standing now in the very seat of judgment above him. She did not enlighten him. Not yet. She had learned over the last 2 years the exact value of timing. "Masters of the council," she began, and her voice carried clean into the vaulted dark. The voice of a woman who had once negotiated with hill lords who wanted her head, who had settled a war in an afternoon in a language she had taught herself out of necessity. "The southern medicine trade holds the following claims against the crown of the northern reaches." She began to read. She read from the very ledger she had balanced by candlelight on her last night in that castle. Read the debts as they had stood the night she left. Read debt by debt how each had gone unpaid and compounded across 2 years of neglect. Read the broken contract, the insulted merchants, the grain rotted for want of a signature that no one left in that castle knew how to properly give. She read it all in her small, precise, devastating way, and the hall grew very quiet, because it was becoming plain to everyone. Listening, this woman understood the inner workings of the Northern Crown's finances better than anyone in the Northern delegation. Better, it was becoming horribly clear, than the king himself. Vera was the first to understand something was wrong. Bryn saw it happen. The sharpening of that beautiful cold face. The flick of dark eyes from Bryn to Roderick and back. Vera did not recognize her either. But Vera was a predator, and predators sense a trap before they can name it. "You seem," Odessa Vane said dryly, when Bryn paused, remarkably well acquainted with the Northern Crown's private accounts age. More so, one might say, than the Northern Crown's own representatives. "I am acquainted with them, Councilmaster," Bryn said, "because for 3 years, I balanced them myself." The words dropped into the silence, and the silence swallowed them whole. For one long heartbeat no one moved. Then Roderick Ashvane looked at her. Truly looked for the first time. Bryn watched it happen in stages, watched the golden face change as the plain dark-clad guild agent resolved, slowly and possibly before his disbelieving eyes, into the woman he had left on a pillow 2 years ago. Watched the color drain from him exactly the way it had drained from her, once in a corridor, listening through a half-open door. She felt for the old bond, the one that had snapped that night, felt nothing where it used to be. It was dead. She had let it die, one honest day at a time, in a garden 3 valleys from here. She is the seat of judgment above her husband, and she felt only the clean, cold clarity of a balanced book. Bryn. His voice cracked on the name. He half rose from the bench. You're alive. I am the agent of the Sunsenfres trade, Bryn said, and her voice did not so much as tremble, and I am presenting my claim. He sat. She watched him sit. This man before whom northern lords had once bowed, sitting down at 2 words from the woman he had discarded. And she understood in that instant that the reversal was complete, and that it had cost her nothing but 2 years of quiet, patient work. You know this woman, Odessa Vane observed. Not a question, she's my wife. Roderick's voice was shaking now. My queen, she vanished, we thought. I was not dead. Bryn, I was building the business whose claim I now present. And I was never your queen, Roderick, you told me so yourself. She let the words fall, plain and cold, exactly as he had once let his fall through a half-open door. I heard you say it the night before I left. The hall had gone utterly silent. 100 creditors and city masters, people who dealt all day in figures and were unused to seeing them wear such human faces, watched the drama with the particular fascination of an audience that had not known it was about to be given a show. Master Vane, Bryn said, turning back to the council. I present my claim against the Northern Crown, and I ask this council for judgment. She paused. But I will say one thing more, and it is not part of my claim. You may weigh it as you see fit. She looked down the length of the hall at the man she had married. This kingdom is not failing because it was cursed. It is not failing because its queen vanished. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. It is failing because its king never learned to govern it, and never had to. Because Asphalt governed it for him, and asked for nothing in return, and he mistook her silence for her insignificance, and he threw her away. Silence, thick as the stone around them. The debts you have heard read out today are not the work of ill fortune, Bryn continued. They are the exact, predictable cost of a man who did not know what he had until it walked out through the dark. She paused. On the last night I kept his books, I wrote them, marred the true state of his debts, so that no one could ever say I caused the ruin I merely foresaw. The ledger is before you, my hand. My date. Nearly 2 years old now. Read it, and you will see I told the truth then. I am telling it now. Odessa Vane called for the ledger. It was brought. She read the margin note in her own time, and when she looked up, something like respect, genuinely, visibly rare on that severe old face, moved across her features. This, she said slowly, is the most complete and honest account of a crown's finances I have seen presented to this council in 30 years. She set the ledger down. Agent, the council will consider your claim. But I find I have a question for you first, and it is not a question of figures. She leaned forward. What is it you actually want? For you have not come here as a woman who wants money. You have come as a woman who wants something considerably harder to weigh. Bryn was silent a moment. It was the true question, the one waiting beneath every other. She had known it would come. Had spent 9 days on the road and 2 years before that, deciding exactly how she would answer it. I want what I am owed, she said finally, not by the crown. The crown's debt is a matter of figures, and I will accept the council's judgment on it, whatever that judgment is. She looked at Roderick, and her voice, when it came, was quiet, terrible, and entirely without cruelty. I want it recorded in the register of this council, the register that outlasts kings, that the northern reaches were governed for 3 years by a woman its king called a substitute. I want it written where it cannot be unwritten, so that when the histories are told, and they will be told, no one can say she vanished for no reason. Or that the kingdom fell by chance. A pause. That is what I want. Not gold. The truth in the ledger where it cannot be erased. The gold I find I no longer need. Her chin lifted slightly. I built my own. For a long moment Odessa Vane simply regarded her. Then the old council master did something that made the entire hall draw breath at once. She rose. She before whom kings had sat below the salt for 30 years, inclined her head to the dark-clad woman standing among the agents of the southern trade. It will be recorded, she said, every word, let the register show it. For a long moment the hall simply breathed. 100 creditors letting out something between a sigh and a murmur, the particular sound of an audience that has just watched a debt of honor settled as cleanly as a debt of coin. Somewhere near the back, a guildmaster who had lost 2 shipments to the failing North's broken roads wiped, unashamed, at his eye. It should have ended there. Bryn allowed herself, for exactly the length of that breath, to believe that it had. Then Odessa Vane lifted one hand, and the hall settled again, and Bryn understood, with the same cold clarity that had once caught a forged signature in a stack of 9 nights' worth of ledgers, that the council master was not finished. There is one more matter, the council master said, And something in her voice had changed. Gone flat, gone careful. The voice of a woman about to open a door she had kept closed for 30 years for good reason. One that has waited a great deal longer than 2 years to be brought before this council. She gestured, and a clerk brought forward a second set of documents. Older, the parchment yellowed with age in a way the fresh ink of Bryn's ledger was not. Some months passed, Odessa Vane said. A woman calling herself an emissary of House Ashvane petitioned this council privately, requesting the sealed archives be reopened on a matter concerning the death, some 20 years ago, of the late Queen of the Northern Reaches, Roderick Ashvane's own mother. The hall's murmur sharpened into something else: attention. Hunger. The particular hush of an audience realizing the show was not in fact over. Bryn's stomach dropped. She turned. Found Kestra's eyes in the gallery above, half hidden beneath her hood, Wren asleep against her shoulder. Kestra's had done this months ago, apparently quietly before their paths had even crossed on a lonely road above the Bramwood. I petitioned that archive, Kestra said, rising from the gallery, her voice carrying down into the hall with steadiness that surprised even Bryn, who had watched this woman weep with exhaustion on a road 9 days ago. Because I have spent the better part of 2 years gathering proof of what actually killed my mother. And it was not a fever. Roderick's head snapped up. Kestra. It was Kestra, cutting across him, and the hall went utterly still. Administered slowly. Over the better part of a year, 20 years passed, by people in the pay of House Stonewell, the very house our father was persuaded, not long after, to align himself with through marriage. First his own, then when that alliance proved insufficient, Vera Stonewell had gone white. This is preposterous, she said, and for the first time, that cold, composed voice cracked at the edges. Slander. Baseless accusation from a grieving woman looking for someone to blame. The steward's confession says otherwise, Kestra said, and produced from beneath her cloak a folded document that had traveled half a continent sewn into the lining of a stole. Taken under considerably less pleasant circumstances than this hearing, I'll admit. But every word of it corroborated independently by the physician's altered notes I also carry, and by payment records this council-owned archivists confirmed as authentic weeks ago. Odessa Vane's expression did not change, which told Bryn everything she needed to know. This was not news to the council master. This was a card she had been holding patiently for exactly the right moment to play it. The archives confirm, Odessa Vane said, that House Stonewell's involvement in the death of the previous Queen of the Northern Reaches is at minimum worthy of formal investigation. At most, it constitutes a crime against the crown that predates and considerably outweighs any question of unpaid trade debts. The hall had gone electric. Bryn stood very still in the middle of it, watching 2 years of careful, patient work, something she had never planned for, never orchestrated, never even known was coming. Kestra had built her own case, in silence alongside Bryn's, 2 women, in 2 different corners of a broken kingdom, independently assembling the proof that would finally bring the whole rotten structure down. Vera rose from the bench, fury and panic warring openly on her face for the first time since Bryn had laid eyes on her. You have no proof of intent, she said. A confession under duress. Notes that could be forged by anyone with a grudge against my house. The payment records are not forged, Odessa Vane said flatly. This council's archivists have confirmed the seals independently. And I would remind you, Lady Stonewell, that you stand in a hall built entirely on the principle that a signature does not lie, no matter how badly its author wishes it would. Vera's mouth opened, closed. For the first time since Bryn had watched her swirl wine and ask what becomes of the substitute, Vera Stonewell had nothing to say at all. Roderick had gone very still on the bench beside her. Bryn watched something move across his face, not shock, not exactly. Something closer to recognition. The recognition of a man finally, belatedly, understand the shape of the trap he had spent years walking obliviously into. You, he said slowly, looking at Vera as though seeing her for the first time. Your family. You didn't just want the marriage you wanted. I wanted what was owed to my house, Vera said lowish, the composure finally, completely gone. What your mother's people stole from mine 3 generations ago. This was never about you, Roderick. It was never about her. A sharp glance at Bryn. You were both simply the easiest doors into a crown that should have belonged to my family from the start. The hall had gone utterly, breathlessly silent. Bryn looked at the woman who had once called her convenient. Looked at the ruin spreading across that beautiful composed face and felt, for the first time since a corridor nearly 2 years ago, not triumph, something closer to pity. Small, reluctant. But there's, because Vera Stonewell had never once in her entire calculated life built anything of her own. She had only ever taken, and a person who has only ever taken has nothing left standing once the taking finally stops. Odessa Vane called for order, and slowly the hall settled. This council, she said, will render 2 judgments today where we expected only one.
She looked first at the master ledger,
then at the stolen documents Kestra had laid before them. The first concerns the debts of House Ashvane, and will proceed as previously outlined. The Northern Crown's trade routes seized in lieu of payment, administered by guild masters until the debt is cleared. Given the scale of the deficit, that administration will likely span a generation. A murmur through the hall. Roderick's face had gone the color of old ash. The second, Odessa Vane continued, concerns House Stonewell and the crime this council has just heard credible, corroborated testimony of. Regicide by poison is not a matter this council typically holds jurisdiction over. But where it intersects, as it clearly does here, with the deliberate financial ruin of a sovereign house for the benefit of the perpetrator, it becomes very much our business indeed. She looked directly at Vera. House Stonewell's assets within this council's jurisdiction are seized, effective immediately. Every trade privilege, every guild membership, every line of credit this council has ever extended to your family, revoked. Permanently. And this council will forward its full findings to every allied court from here to the Northern Sea, with a formal recommendation that House Stonewell be barred from noble standing anywhere those findings are received. Vera's knees buckled. A guard caught her arm before she fell. This is destruction, she whispered. Total destruction. Yes, Odessa Vane said, without a trace of sympathy. It generally is for those who build a fortune on a foundation of poison and stolen ledgers. I find this council is not in the business of softening that particular lesson. It took the better part of an hour for the hall to fully empty. Creditors murmuring to each other, in shocked, satisfied clusters. City masters already drafting the language that would carry this day's judgment to every allied court within a month's ride. The graying guildmaster with hands like weathered rope found Bryn near the great doors before she left, and said nothing at first, only studied her the way a woman studies another woman she has just watched. Do something she herself had not believed possible in a room like this one. 30 years I've brought claims to this council, the old woman said finally. Watched kings weep. Watch merchants beg. Never once watched anybody walk out of that hall with more dignity than they walked in with. She extended a weathered hand. Whatever you decide to do next, girl, my guild would be glad to trade with you on your name alone.
That's not a thing I say slightly.
Bryn took the offered hand. Shook it once, the way she had learned to shake hands with guildmasters who assumed, at first, that a woman's grip meant nothing at all. I'll remember that, she said, and meant it. The Iron Guildmaster, younger and considerably less given to sentiment, only nodded once in her direction as he passed, the particular nod of a man revising, permanently, his estimate of what a quiet woman in dark wool might actually be capable of. It was not warmth exactly, but Bryn had learned over 2 hard years that respect rarely announces itself with warmth. More often it simply stops arguing. Vera was escorted out under guard, stripped of the sapphire at the door, a small, almost incidental cruelty that Bryn watched without feeling much of anything at all. The jewel meant nothing now, it never really had. Roderick remained alone on the low bench long after his advisors had filed out, gray-faced and silent, long after the hall itself had begun to empty around him. Bryn watched him from across the vast space, a man who had ridden into this city, still believing in some stubborn corner of himself, that his crown and his charm would be enough to talk his way through anything. That belief was gone now. She could see it in the way he sat, hollowed out, finally completely understanding the size of what he had lost and how much of the losing had been entirely his own doing. She almost left without speaking to him. She had every right to. Her business here was concluded. Her claim was recorded. The truth was written where it could not be unwritten, and that had always been the whole of what she had come for. But Halden's hand found her arm, gentle, and when she looked at him, the old man simply nodded toward the empty bench, toward the man sitting alone in the wreckage of everything he had built. Your business is finished, Halden said quietly. His isn't. Not yet. Whatever you say to him now, girl, say it because you choose to. Not because you owe some singled. Bryn looked a long moment at Roderick. Then she crossed the hall. He looked up when her shadow fell across him. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. You could have told me, he said finally. Horse, before all of this you could have sent word. You told a room full of servants and one silver-tongued liar that I was a substitute, Bryn said. Not cruel. Just flat. Just true. I owed you nothing after letter. Not a warning, not even the courtesy of letting you know I was still breathing. He flinched, actually flinched like the words had weight. I was wrong, he said, about all of it, about her, about you. He looked up and there was something raw in his face she had never once seen in 3 years of marriage, not even in their better moments, the rare ones, the ones she had once mistaken for love. I didn't know what I had, Bryn. Not until the numbers stopped adding up and I finally understood exactly whose intent had been keep them straight all along. I know, she said. I read the same reports you did, grain rotting. Guilds pulling credit. A garrison walking away in the night because no one paid them. A pause. You had 2 years to learn what I did every single day for 3. You didn't learn it because it was hard. You learned it because there was finally no one left to do it for you. Roderick said nothing. There was nothing really to say to that. I have a son, Bryn said quietly, deciding in that moment that he had earned at least this much of the truth, even if he had earned nothing else. He's healthy, he's strong. He is entirely, completely mine, and he will grow up never knowing what it feels like to be called a substitute for anything. Roderick's face broke open, grief and hope and shame all at once, tangled together in a way that made even his carefully guarded chest ache just slightly, despite everything. A son, he whispered. Bryn when he's grown, she said, cutting him off before hope could take root somewhere it had no business growing. I will tell him who his father is, all of it. The truth, good and cold together. And I will let him decide, entirely for himself, whether he wants a father, or a birthright, or neither one at all. Her voice hardened, just slightly. Not yours. Not mine, his. Please. Roderick's voice cracked entirely. Let me see him just once. I don't ask him for anything moment. This golden, hollowed-out man who had once made her believe, foolishly, that love could be built one honest stone at a time. Who had thrown all of that away over a wine cup and a silver-tongued liar, and who was only now, in the wreckage of everything, beginning to understand what he had actually lost. No, she said, gentle but final. Not today. Maybe not for years yet. You have to become someone worth introducing to him first. That's not a debt this council can help you settle. That one's entirely your own to pay. She turned to go, Bryn. His voice behind her small, in a way she had never once heard it. What do I do now? The trade routes are gone, the crown's worth nothing. Vera's house is destroyed, I have nothing left. Bryn paused, did not turn back. Learn the numbers, she said. Learn the names. Learn to sit in a room and understand exactly what's being asked of you, instead of trusting someone else to understand it for you. A beat. Become, if you can manage it, the man you should have been from the start. It's the only throne still open to you now. Whether you take it is entirely up to you. She walked away, and this time she did not look back. It was the second and last time in this whole long story that she would let herself do that, and she did it exactly the way an old man had taught her once, in the dark, above a well. She found Halden and Garrick waiting at the hall's great doors, Kestra beside them with Ren stirring awake against her shoulder, small fists working the air the way infants do when the world outside is finally, unmistakably, interesting enough to wake up for. Bryn took her son, held him against her chest, felt, for the first time in nearly 2 years, the particular singular piece of a debt finally, completely settled, not just the crown's debt though that mattered. The one she had been carrying since a corridor, since a half-open door, since a voice that had called her convenient and meant it as a peach. It's done, she said quietly. It's done, Halden agreed. For now, Kestra added, and there was something almost wry in it, the exhausted, hard-won humor of people who have just survived something enormous together. Vera's mother is still out there somewhere. This isn't finished the way fairy tales finish. Nothing this large ever really is. No, Bryn agreed. But it's finished enough for today. She looked down at Ren, at his dark, watchful eyes, so old for an infant's face, taking in the great vaulted doors of High Reach with an expression that already impossibly looked like curiosity rather than fear. For today, she said again, it's finished enough. They rode south 3 days later. Away from the mountains, away from a crown that no longer belonged to anyone in any way that mattered, back toward a border town and a herb house and a garden that would need replanting come spring. Garrick rode beside her the whole way, quiet in the way he was always quiet, steady, present, asking nothing of her that she had not already decided on her own to give. What happens now, he asked, somewhere on the 3rd day, as the mountains finally began to fade behind them. Bryn looked ahead. At the road. At the sun sleeping against her chest, entirely unaware that he had just watched, from a gallery above a council hall, the collapse of an entire kingdom. His mother had once quietly kept standing now, she said. We go home, we rebuild the garden, we watch him grow. A small, real smile, the first easy one in longer than she could remember. And someday, when he's old enough to understand it, I tell him the truth. All of it. The corridor and the tunnel and the debt and the crown he could have worn and chose entirely on his own whether to claim. And if he chooses it? Then he'll walk into it with his eyes open, Bryn said. Knowing exactly what it costs to hold something worth having. Knowing exactly what it costs to lose it too, if you're foolish enough to mistake the person holding it together for something you can simply throw away. Garrick was quiet a moment, watching the road ahead of them, the way he had watched it every mile of this whole impossible journey. And if he doesn't choose it? Bryn's smile deepened, soft and certain in a way that had nothing left in it of the frightened woman who had once crawled through a filthy tunnel in the dark, counting handholds, refusing to think. Then he lives free, she said. Which was always in the end the only crown that ever actually mattered. The road stretched south ahead of them, toward home, toward a garden waiting for spring, toward a life built one honest stone at a time by a woman who had once been called a substitute, and had spent nearly 2 unforgettable years proving, beyond any argument a council or a crown or a golden lyre could ever mount, exactly how wrong that word had always been. Epilogue: the crown he chose, the herb house in Fenmore, grew a second story. 11 years later, the year Wren turned 11, and finally outgrew the loft where he had slept since he was old enough to climb the ladder himself. Garrick built it. Of course he built it. He had been building things around that garden for over a decade by then. A fence one autumn, a proper well the next. Slowly, patiently. The way he did everything, laid down beside Bryn's without either of them ever quite naming what it had become. Neither of them needed the naming. Some things are truer left unspoken, the way a signature is truer than a promise has, because a signature does not need to be believed in order to hold. Wren grew up knowing 3 things without ever being told them outright. The way children absorb the shape of a house before they understand its architecture. He knew his mother had once lived somewhere very far away, somewhere grand, and had chosen to leave it. He knew old Halden, who had settled into a cottage at the edge of the Fenmore garden, and taught him, over the long slow years, to hold a blade properly and to read a room the way his mother read a ledger, had once served a great house and had chosen, in the end, to serve something better than a crown. And he knew, though no one had ever said the word aloud in his hearing, that he was different. Not dramatically. Not in any way the other children in Fenmore's market square would have noticed. But there were nights, still rare ones, when a candle in the house would gutter for no reason at all, and his mother would look at him a certain way, careful and proud and afraid all at once, and he understood, the way children understand weather, that something about him ran deeper than the surface anyone else could see. She told him the whole of it on his 12th birthday. Not because 12 was some magic number. Because Bryn had decided, the year Kestra came to stay with them for a season and told stories by the fire of a court neither Wren nor Garrick had ever set foot in, that a boy old enough to ask real questions deserved real answers, and Wren had begun, that autumn, to ask them. She told him about the corridor, about the words that had ended a marriage before he was ever born. About a tunnel beneath a physic garden and a man named Roderick Ashvane, who wore an iron crown that had by then been stripped of nearly everything that made it worth wearing. She told him he was the last living heir of a house whose name he had never once heard spoken as his own. Wren listened to all of it with the particular stillness that Ottilie had once remarked on in his mother, the calm, terrible focus of someone who does not scream when the floor drops away, but simply quietly recalculates where to put their feet. "Do you want me to have it?" he asked when she finished. "The crown? Is that what you're telling me?" "I'm telling you, it's yours to want or not want," Bryn said. "That was always the whole of the promise I made myself the night I carried you out of that castle. Not that you'd be a king. Only that you'd be free to decide whether you wanted to be one." Wren had thought about it for the better part of a year before he said anything more on the subject. He was in this, as in most things, his mother's son. He did not grab, he did not flee. He gathered what he needed to know, quietly, patiently, and he waited until the ground beneath his feet felt solid enough to stand on before he moved at all. When he finally rode north, at 17, it was not with an army, and it was not in secret. He rode with Halden at his side, gray now and slower still, but refusing, flatly, to let the boy make the journey without him, and with a satchel of his mother's careful notes on exactly what he would find when he arrived. Bryn did not ride with him. "This part isn't mine to walk," she told him. The morning he left, standing at the garden gate with her hand on his shoulder the way her own mother's ring still sat, thin and worn against her collarbone. "I gave you the truth. What you build from it has to be built by your own hands, or it won't hold the way you need it to." "You built everything you have with your own hands," Wren said. "I did," Bryn agreed. "And so will you. That's the whole of what I'm trying to teach you. standing here being far too sentimental about a gate. He found his father older than he expected, and smaller than the stories had led him to believe a king ought to be. Roderick Ashvane had spent 17 years by then, learning the numbers his wife had once carried for him in silence, and the learning had cost him nearly everything a golden young man believes belongs to him by right. There was no love left to declare between them, not the kind minstrels sing about. But there was, when Roderick looked up and saw in his son's face the unmistakable shape of a woman he had once thrown away without ever understanding what he was throwing, something that might, with time and effort neither of them would rush, become respect. "I'm not here to take anything from you," Ren told him, in a hall considerably smaller and considerably less golden than the one his mother had once stood in, years before he was old enough to remember it. "I'm here because she said the choice was mine, and I decided I wanted to look you in the eye before I made it." "And what have you decided?" Roderick asked. His voice, older now, had lost the easy confidence Bryn remembered from a corridor she had described to her once, and never in detail she thought a boy needed to carry. Ren considered the question the way his mother considered a column of figures that did not yet add up. "I've decided I don't want your crown," he said finally. "I want to know how you rebuilt what was left of it. I want to learn the numbers myself the way she had to, and I want to see whether there's something worth keeping standing here once it's built on truth, instead of science. If there is, I'll help you build it properly. Not as your heir, as a man who chooses to." It was not the answer Tsepsumtkam, in the private, foolish corner of himself that still hoped after everything, for something like forgiveness handed to him easily. It was, Halden told him afterward quietly, the only answer a boy raised by Bryn Ashvane was ever going to give. Vera Stonewell was never seen again in any court that mattered. Her house's name struck so thoroughly from every allied register that within a generation it survived only as a cautionary phrase merchants used when warning young apprentices against building fortunes on borrowed foundations. So, what became of her mother, the true architect behind 2 ruined houses and 1 dead queen? The records of High Reach note only that she died, some years later in obscurity, in a border town not unlike the one where a woman she had hunted once built an entire life out of nothing more than patience and a candle. Kestra never married. She said, when anyone was foolish enough to ask, that she had already found the truest kind of family a person could hope for, in a garden 3 valleys south of the mountains where nobody had ever once mistaken her silence for her insignificance, and she saw no particular reason to go looking for anything grander than that. And Bryn Rue, who had once been Bryn Ashvane, who would spend the whole of the rest of her long well-built life answering to whichever name suited the moment, and letting neither one define her, lived to watch her son become exactly the kind of man she had once hoped, in a candlelit room with a hollow behind a tapestry that he might someday choose to be. Not a king who inherited his throne, a man who built it, one honest stone at a time, because he had watched his mother do exactly that, and had learned, the way the best lessons are always learned, simply by growing up beside her. She kept the herb garden until the end of her days, kept the deed to a cottage she never once needed to use, kept her mother's thin, worn ring on a cord around her neck, long after the sapphire and the coronet, and every scrap of gold pressed into her hand as payment for playing a part had been forgotten by everyone who had once thought them the measure of her worth. And on the evenings when the work was done and the garden had been put properly to bed for the night, she would sit by the fire with Garrick's steady hand in hers, and she would think, sometimes, of a half-open door in a castle she had not set foot in for the better part of 2 decades, and that a substitute. She never once, in all the years that followed, needed to hear it called anything else, because she had already proven, in the one room in the world where the truth could never be laughed away, exactly what she had seized been. Not a placeholder. The load-bearing wall. The one thing the whole house had been standing on, all along, whether anyone inside it had ever bothered to notice. And if you are listening to this tonight, wherever you are, however far you have carried your own quiet weight for people who never once thought to ask what it cost you, let this be the thing you take with you when the fire burns down and the house goes quiet. The ones who hold a life together rarely get thanked for it while they are doing the holding. The thanks, if it comes at all, comes later, and it comes in a currency far more lasting than gratitude. It comes in the simple, unshakable knowledge that when the walls everyone else built came down, yours were the only ones still standing. Build anyway, balance the books nobody else will balance. Plant the garden nobody else believes will grow. Walk out through whatever dark tunnel you have to. If the door in front of you only ever opens onto a room where your worth gets measured by someone else's convenience, the truth waits a long time sometimes. It waited 2 years for Bryn Ashvane, in a small stone room above a garden that did not yet exist, in a ledger closed by candlelight on the very last night anyone ever dared call her a substitute. But it does wait. And when it finally speaks in whatever hall or hearth or quiet kitchen table life eventually brings you to, it speaks the truth. Clean. Plain. Undenied. It remembers, long after the golden liars have been forgotten, exactly who was holding the whole house up all along. That is the whole of the story and the whole of the promise inside it, not vengeance. Not a crown reclaimed for its own sake, only this. That the quiet, patient work of an honest life is never truly invisible, not forever. And that the door someone once closed on you softly without a second thought, can one day be the very door you walk back through, on your own 2 feet, to finally be seen. Remember her name the way the register at High Reach remembers it still, long after every crown in that story turned to dust.
Not a substitute.
Never a substitute. Only ever the one who was building quietly the whole time.